gavel. Haven't done that before. So it is 8 p.m. This is the March 6th meeting of the Water Company Subcommittee of the Advisory Committee, and I call the meeting to order. So I'd...
It is 8 p.m. and I call to order the Board of Selectmen.
So I'd like to review tonight where we are in the evaluation process. We've been receiving a lot of information, some of it conflicting. We received some additional information this evening. Thank you. And we received earlier this week some information from Polly Rowe, a Hull resident, and we've been receiving, the full advisory committee has been receiving various emails from different Hingham residents. So, as I say, we have a lot of information. We have 4 warrant articles to review and start with MM, the acquisition, since that all the others flow from that. I will note that it's unfortunate that we had the snow on Monday, since that's put us behind in the schedule, and I guess we'll require that we have our meeting on the weekend to catch up, but that's the way it is. So, as I see it, in sort of a way to sort of frame the discussion, the principal matters factoring into the decision on MM, financial, first and foremost. Can the town, the ratepayers, afford this? Is it a good deal when balanced by all other matters relating to this? Is it a good deal for the ratepayers? So that's an analysis of the financial models, principally. There are a number of subsidiary points, which we've talked about, and some we haven't delved into greatly. Bonding authority, general obligation versus revenue bonds, especially where many of the assets are in another community. What's the impact on the town's credit rating and borrowing capacity? Those questions overlap with Article 00, the enterprise fund, in a way. So there's financial. Then there's governance and operations, and this overlaps with Article NN. Right? So does the town have the ability to run or acquire services from others to run the water system efficiently and safely? Is the proposed governance structure that's in Article, I guess, NN, is it prudent? Is it workable? Will the large number of non-Hingham ratepayers pose difficulties for operations? How do we assure fairness to non-Hingham ratepayers? There's been talk about an intermunicipal agreement, pros and cons of that, what that would look like. Does that make sense? Will the town be able, getting to operations, will the town be able to do a better or a worse job at investing in the system than private ownership? Be able to replace and repair mains more frequently, coordinate with other town activities such as road paving? Is that likely or not? Thirdly, are there intangible benefits to, or detriments of town ownership? So examples of benefits that occur to me, just simply owning and controlling your own water supply may be a significant benefit. Would avoiding periodic changes in corporate ownership be a benefit or not? Would avoiding the cost and disruption of periodic DPU rate cases be a pro or not? Downsides, perhaps, of taking over the responsibility for the system. You're responsible for the water supply and the water quality of a highly regulated industry. So there's a potential for significant issues, for example, if the supply were contaminated. You need to assure adequate quality and also adequate supply. Is the town up to that? And is that a risk that, is it a real risk? Is it something that we want to take on? And then Article, I guess, PP, are there any transition obstacles that would, present themselves to the basic acquisition? So let's turn in detail to financial issues. Does the acquisition make sense or not based on the models we've seen? We're predicting a long way into the future. Are the models and their assumptions conservative or aggressive? How much leeway is there in the numbers if something goes wrong, either end? Towns proposing financing over 30 years with 1 year short-term borrowing and then another 29 years. Seems, I think that's a given. Question, what is the price? So based on the formula, it's approximately $108 million, as I understand it, $107,837,567, plus an update based on Aquarion's capital investment from 2018 to town meeting. So the total cost, we don't exactly know, but I guess that's the general range. So, Dave, I turn to you and ask you to sort of lead a discussion on what you've been thinking of on financial issues.
And then if you want to hand out there, Victor, you've got 3 documents. That top one is kind of a cover memo I'll touch on first. The second one is a snippet of the, until today, the most recent letters from Bloom Shapiro. I'm good, I got it. From Bloom and from Anderson, and we'll talk about that. And then the third is the financial kind of analysis that I prepared. And let me just say at the outset that my last name is spelled with an O, not an E. There is no Anderson model, there is an Andersen model. Let's keep our Scandinavian names straight. I don't get paid to do this. Anderson. If you have an E, you do, apparently. So the goal of tonight, and we did get new information late today which will inform this, so it's not an accident that it's stamped draft. But the goal of tonight was to really try to identify some of the key assumptions that differ from the town's perspective and from Aquarion's perspective, and then to try to frame the magnitude of those differences and what the impact of those assumptions may be, and what, can we begin ourselves to have an opinion about which of those assumptions, on which side do we fall, and is there a gray area in between where we can all find some comfort. So Aquarion did share with us their financial model in live format. So, and anyone who's worked with Excel knows that using someone else's model is fraught with peril, but I compliment them. I think I was able to figure it out, and I think I was able to run some scenarios on Aquarion's ownership using Aquarion's model. So the implication of that would be that is Aquarion's view of their ownership. And Aquarion has made some assertions in today's submissions around Anderson's view of Aquarion's borrowing, for example, and some other factors. I'm not sure that factors into my analysis because I took Aquarion's model as the basis for Aquarion's costs. What I did then was vary some assumptions, and we'll talk about that. Now, so let's take a look quickly at this one. This is the Bloom Shapiro. So just to orient you, and what I've done for you, actually my daughter did this, you can tell the handwriting. I've identified for you a couple key line items, and then I've identified row number, row 6, R5, R7, row 5, row 7, and that'll make sense when we see the model, but just to orient you about where those data points show up in my model. So there's going to be, in summary, based on Bloom's letter from February 25th, they set forth what they viewed as kind of the base case delta between the billing impact of town ownership and the billing impact of Aquarion ownership of a $12.6 million negative impact to a customer bill from Aquarion's ownership. Excuse me, from the town's ownership versus Aquarion. That's Aquarion's view.
By chance, are there any extra copies?
There are some copies here, not of the letter that he's referring to.
No, that's
the letter that he's referring to is the Bloom Shapiro
this is the Bloom
letter
Shapiro,
from last
February
week.
25th.
May I come up and grab another copy?
You may.
Sure, thank you.
And you guys can grab a cut, yeah. So, yeah, page 1 then is the kind of net basis. Page 2 of this write-up, again, is from the Bloom Shapiro letter of February 25th. And I just want to call out a couple of the variables here that we'll discuss tonight. First is the debt cost. That's going to show up in row 1. The second is the treatment plant lease, and the third is the approved revenues. And then if you turn onto the third page of this handout, again, this is from Bloom Shapiro. This is now Bloom Shapiro's view of town ownership. The last two variables that we're going to talk about are going to be the town operations and maintenance costs, and then the annual capital replenishment line item, which is the context in which Bloom is making a case around prevailing wage impact. So let's do this. Why don't we turn to the model, which looks like this. And don't be alarmed. I think it'll make sense once we go through it. What I'm going to do at first is walk through scenario 1, which is the farthest left column. It starts with the green highlighted 0.89%. And this is going to be the same analysis kind of rolled forward then in 3 more scenarios after scenario 1. But scenario 1 is intended to represent what I believe is the Bloom-Shapiro view. And you will see, the reason I gave you the Bloom-Shapiro letter, first page, is you'll see numbers in scenario 1 that tie with the Bloom-Shapiro letter. So let's just go down scenario 1 line by line, and I've numbered the rows, so I'll reference it that way. Row number 1 is the debt cost spread versus the town. This is at 0.89%. We'll come back to talk about this assumption, but you heard me ask about it. You've heard, certainly you've heard the town's experts talk about this. You've heard Aquarian talk about this. I think this is an issue that we can dig deeper on. The next one, row 2, is going to be the rate case realization percentage. Again, this is at 82%. And what this basically amounts to is of the rate request amount, what percent of the requested amount does the DPU grant to Aquarian in a rate case? So in their projections over the years to come in the future, they are making a case about what the rate request would be, and then they're asserting now that 82, in this scenario, and this is their base case again, they're asserting that 82% is the right number, right fraction of the requested amount that they are granted by DPU. Now, the basis for their 82, we'll talk about. It has to do with an average of their last 3 cases, but the last 3 cases have gone steadily up to the last one, which was at 98%. So we can talk about whether an average is the right approach or not. Next, row 3 and row 4, Aquarian cost inflation rate and Hingham cost inflation rate. This is one of the Anderson tax assumptions related to apples in their view. And as we know, Aquarian has made a case that perhaps that 3% is not the right number for their cost inflation rate, and we'll talk about that in a later scenario. So when you use the Aquarian model with these assumptions, you come up with a total customer impact of $551,519,735, which ties, except they rounded it, to page 1 of the Bloom-Shapiro analysis. What I deduct then, because what we're really looking at here is what's the cost to the customer bill from Aquarian ownership versus the cost from town ownership, is I deduct a Bloom-Shapiro's view, until this afternoon maybe, of what the town cost would be, which they assert would be $564 million and so forth. The delta there being the 12.571. And then what I do, because the numbers are so big, I think they kind of get lost, is I divide that by the number of years, which is 30, and then I divide it by the number of connections, which I guess is a proxy for customer, which is 13,168 as of, I think, the end of 2017. So now we've got a number that at least is something we can talk without taking 30 minutes to just say the number, $31.82. So in this scenario, at this point, if you believe nothing else, this would say that holding all else constant with these assumptions based in Bloom-Shapiro's analysis, the ratepayer on the customer bill on an annual basis per connection, if in fact connections is a fair proxy for customers, would be $31.82 higher if the town owned it. Now recognize, in this as in all scenarios here, that included in the cost of town ownership is the cost of buying the water company. So the $108 million that you recognize. At the end of 30 years, there's a major savings as that acquisition debt is paid off. So that's an important thing to look at here. I think you're talking about 2 models of ownership, In the case of Aquarian owning it, in my view, it's kind of like renting an apartment. In the case of the town owning it, you're paying a mortgage and you own your house. And the question here is, you're comparing the same bill, even though one is paying a mortgage and one is paying rent implicitly, if that makes sense. Are there any questions about that 3182? So I've really done no work here other than to divide their 12,571 by 30 years and then the number of connections. So the analysis is about to begin. Anybody got any questions? Okay. All right, so moving down then now. Now we're going to get to Aquarian costs, line items that I say call Aquarian ownership costs that Aquarian excluded that the town believes should be included in the model. And again, all of the next rows are going to be replicated exactly across the four scenarios. So the changes in the four scenarios are in rows above row 10. From 10 to 18, these assumptions are going to be held constant, and they're going to, as you're going to see, they're going to impact the town's view of town ownership. So the treatment plant lease expense is the first question, and you heard Mr. Coughlin speak at the last meeting, or maybe it was Mr. Ryan. Kerry Ryan spoke about it. Certainly, the town views that this $9.776 million is an expense that should be in Aquarian's model. Aquarian has a view that it doesn't belong there, and I'm not capable right now of telling you the pros and cons, but suffice it to say that at least I think what the public testimony has been so far that we've heard is that the town feels strongly that that is a cost that should be on Aquarian and would be reflected in a customer bill in Aquarian ownership, and Aquarian is disputing that. Let's assume for the moment, as we roll down this, that you take the town's position. That would add almost $10 million over the 30 years to Aquarian's customer bill impact, which when you divide by 30 and divide by the connections gets to an add back of about $24.75. So on a net basis now in scenario one again, the 3182, you have an add back so that the incremental cost from town ownership versus Aquarian is now a cost of $7.08. Moving on, we now move to Hingham ownership costs that Aquarian includes that the town disputes. So we've flipped it now, and now this is Aquarian's view of town ownership includes what Aquarian asserts is an additional $8.8 million in the capital replenishment line related to the question of prevailing wage. And we discussed that at the last meeting with both Anderson and with Aquarian. And I think, again, I'm not a prevailing wage expert. I'm much less so than the folks that spoke about it last week. But the magnitude of this discussion point is about $8.8 million, which is about $22 a customer. So again, if you take the town's position that there will not be an incremental $8.8 million due to prevailing wage, you would have another add back, in this case of $22.31, and get you to a positive benefit from a customer bill impact under town ownership of $15.24. So we've flipped the 31 at this point in the game to a positive 15 from a negative $31. Now, the final question or assumption that I treat in this table here is the question of Hingham's ownership and maintenance costs. And you'll recall from the presentation that Bloom and Aquarian made last week, they looked at some comparable communities and they asserted that based on the comparable community analysis of their operations and maintenance expenses, that the town was underestimating the cost, despite the fact that the town has evidence that they can get it done. So Aquarian, in their model, has ascribed to the town the costs based on their comparable analysis. The town says that their costs will be lower based on the responses they've received to their RFP. And that order of magnitude is $26,982,000, or on a per connection per year basis, $68 positive benefit in this model. So on a net basis, then when you sum up all of these assumptions, we've moved from the Aquarian assumptions exclusively to now the Hingham view of some of the disputed assumptions. We've done nothing to change the rate. We've done nothing to change the initial assumptions, though, don't forget. So the rate spread is unchanged. The realization rate with respect to the rate cases is unchanged. Inflation rate's unchanged. You end up with an $83.54 positive benefit to the ratepayer under town ownership. Now, as I said, just a quick note, a couple other notes. Line 23 there looks at the reduction in acquisition debt service expense, again, per connection per year, beginning in, forgive me, I'm confused if it's 2049 or 2050, but one of those years after the debt is paid off. In the final year, $6.17 million of debt and principal payments would be paid, and then this year subsequent, that would go away. So a $468 benefit to the ratepayer, a customer, based on a customer bill once the acquisition debt is paid off. All things being equal, that includes CapEx, everything else. That's per year. That is per year. That is a big number, but it's a little bit of a ways out once the debt is paid off. Now let me direct you to page 3 now. Skip page 2 for a second. Page 3 is a graph where I try to put what I just described on a piece of paper where you can see the impact. So in the case of page 3, we're going to read this graph from left to right. The y-axis, as it says, is the incremental savings or cost per connection per year from 2019 to 2049 under town ownership. So this is exactly a graphical representation of what we just went through. I haven't changed a thing. You'll recognize the numbers. On the far left side, if you take the Aquarian assumptions, the negative, it's an incremental cost to the per connection per year of $31. And then in the hash marks, as you move to the right, each hash mark represents the dollar value of the assumption that's been adopted from the treatment plant lease to the prevailing wage to the O&M cost. And in each case, the blue bar is adjusted from the next left quadrant based to the impact. So the 3182, you add the 2475, you get to a negative 708. The negative 708, you add the 2231, you get to 1524 and so forth. So this just kind of juxtaposes for you where the analysis leads based on the current information we have. And this, I think what's important, at least to me, when you look at this graph, is that you can, in this picture, make your own adjustment to some of these assumptions as well. You can, for example, you could say to yourself, well, I agree with the lease expense. I agree that should be a cost for Aquarian. I think the prevailing wage is a real problem. We could, you could strike the prevailing wage $22, and then if you still kept the O&M cost assumptions from Hingham, you'd still be in a positive benefit. You can kind of mentally play with some of these by shrinking. In other words, I think with the exception of maybe the lease expense, certainly the prevailing wage and the O&M cost are continuums. They're not binary assumptions. So there's no reason to believe that you would have to achieve all or none of the cost savings or all or none of the prevailing wage impact. It's conceivable that the answer truly is right in between there. And as my old boss says, it's much better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. So this gives you a chance to be approximately right, I think, as you look at some of these assumptions. Okay, so that's scenario 1. So all we've done still with scenario 1 is look at the base case of Aquarian's assumptions and added back Hingham's view of some of the disputed assumptions. Any questions on scenario 1? All right, let's take a shot then at the scenarios 2, 3, and 4. And to do that, let's first start on page 2. In page 2, I'm going to quickly actually reference the Bloom-Shapiro letter from today because they saved some of my, looks like they read my analysis ahead of time. The question has come up as to what is the appropriate spread between Aquarian's borrowing cost and the town of Hingham's borrowing cost. It obviously is a big driver, and just for clarity's sake, we're not talking about the cost of the debt to buy the company. We're talking about the annual or the maintenance cost, the money that's borrowed by the town or by Aquarian for capital improvements. So the big nut everyone's stipulating has got a rate, and that's not going to vary. What I try to get at here in this analysis, which is similar to some things that we've heard from other of the folks that have spoken before us, is to look at the relative rates, borrowing costs, and try to get an idea about where that assumption really belongs. Just to orient ourselves, scenario 1 that we just looked at, look up at row number 1, the modeled town ownership CapEx funding. So that is to say that the money that the town borrows to fund capital expenditure improvements over the course of their model. starts at a rate of 3.25%, and then you can see this is the Anderson assumption, increases every 3 years by 25 basis points to a 5.75 at the end. In the Aquarian model, Aquarian starts with a refinancing of 4.14% and then refinances every 10 years, increasing at 1% every 10 years. In the letter today from Bloom, they do make, I think, a meaningful point, which is that Aquarian already has some debt on their books, whereas the town obviously has no OpEx or CapEx debt yet. They will initiate it once the acquisition takes place. So Aquarian is kind of in their model, at least as I understand it, they're rolling their refis as some of the debt matures, they take on new debt. And so, again, I am using Aquarian's model to calculate the cost of Aquarian's ownership here. So the complaint that Bloom lays out in their letter about Anderson's view of Aquarian's ownership based on Anderson's view of Aquarian's borrowing as moot as far as my analysis is concerned, because I didn't use Anderson's estimates of Aquarian borrowing. That said, let's now talk about the rate. So what basically is happening in this analysis then is Aquarian, in their base case, is asserting that they're borrowing at 89 basis points better than the town at that time. Look now for a second at, and mind you, the town currently today can borrow at 2.85%, that's row 8, against a 10-year Treasury note of 2.69, so the town's borrowing at 16 basis points above a 10-year Treasury note. The town's model, I might point out, is 40 basis points higher than their current borrowing rate. So the town is implicitly either assuming a rate increase or they're being very conservative in taking that step. Go down to row 16 for a second. And this is some work that we did, and it's confirmed by the letter we got from Bloom today. In 2011, Aquarian Water Company of Massachusetts did a bond issuance, 10-year bond issuance at 4.11% was the coupon. At the time, the Treasury note rate for the 10-year Treasury in November of 11 was 2.01%, so a spread of 2.1%. So that's a spread of 2.1% against, that's a 2.1% spread against the Treasuries, which is significantly higher than the 0.8 spread, which is being assumed in the initial case for Aquarian. So in row 24, what I do is basically say, if the town is implicitly assuming a 3.09% 10-year Treasury in their 3.25 initial rate, and stop me if you care about that math, but trust me, I think it's right. 3.09% is the town's assumption for the 10-year Treasury. If we take Aquarian at their word that they can do another financing at a 2.1% spread off of the Treasury, they should be borrowing at 5.19% in a refi in a scenario in which the Treasury 10 years is at 3.09. If the town initial rate is 3.25, then the spread that would be appropriate based on that analysis would be 1.94%. Now, in the letter from Bloom today, they pointed out a spread, or suggested a spread of 205 basis points, so 11 points higher than me. So let's call 1.94 good, since I already went to Staples and printed these out with 1.94. So that's where 1.94 comes from. Now, there are folks in the room tonight who may argue that 1.94 is low. But for the moment, for argument's sake, let's just take 1.94 and now go back to the financial model. So scenario 2 just changes one variable. It changes the 0.89, which I think even by Aquarian's own analysis is low, and replaces it with a 1.94 spread, again using Aquarian's model with that spread against the 3.25. And we keep the 82% rate case realization the same, we keep inflation rates the same, and I'll spare you the step-by-step, and we'll go down to row 18, and we'll see now that we're at a 99.15% benefit. But let me just make a pit stop at row 9, which is to say what was once a 31% deficit to a customer bill on an annual basis under scenario 1, we're now at a 16% deficit. So we've almost $16.22. So we've almost cut it in half just by resetting the rate to what something that even Aquarian in their letter, as I understood it, said was the appropriate rate. Now, again, We're still owning the building here, we're not renting it. We're ending up with a $468 savings in year 31. Now, I'll quickly go to scenarios 3 and 4 unless people have other questions. In scenario 3, I keep the 1.94 constant now going forward, and what I'm going to vary in scenario 3 is the rate case realization. So, again, I am far from an expert on this. Aquarian makes the case that because their rate case realization history reads as follows: 63% from the 3 cases ago, 86% from 2 cases ago, and then the last case at 98%, we should take an average of those 3 numbers. That's the 82% in the base case and in scenario 2. Now, 98% is the realization rate in the most recent case, and that's the percentage I've used in scenario 3. You know, at some point it would be interesting to know what more details about how they went from 63% to 86 to 98. Was that a change in DPU views? Was it a change in how they presented their case? Was it a change in their test year? You know, there's a lot of variables there, obviously, way beyond my pay grade, but worthy of discussion. And as I sit here today, it doesn't leap out to me that an average is the right number. It may be the right number. I'm just saying that it doesn't leap out to me that with that trend, an average would be where I would end up. Be that as it may, taking the 98% in scenario 3 and jump into line 9, we now see that even before we make any assumptions about Hingham, in Hingham's favor or in Hingham's view, we're in a positive $5.54 from a ratepayer perspective. We get to a total of $121 in row 18. Any questions on 1, 2, or 3? Scenario 4 takes a turn. As you heard in our hearing last week, and then we see repeated in the Bloom analysis today, Aquarian asserted last week, though interestingly, Bloom did not subscribe to it, at least expressly, but made note of it in their prose, just not in their numbers. Aquarian made the assertion that they actually should have their cost inflation rate at 2.2%, or 80 basis points less than the towns at 3%. And the argument there is one that I'll paraphrase in my words as buying power. Buying power to me is chiefly the one that I find credible, which is that I do think that there may be some scale that Aquarian has that affords them the opportunity to negotiate tougher on supplies, pipe, chemicals, as described. That may be a very reasonable. I haven't seen any data to back up their estimate of the 80 basis point delta, but there may be something there. As far as their incentive to keep costs low, I would argue that Aquarian's incentive at the end of the day is to maximize profit, not to keep costs low. So while keeping costs low is a component of maximizing profit, I think that everybody, I think, wants to keep costs low, and no one on the advisory committee is going to suggest this town doesn't want to keep costs low. So that one is a less compelling argument than perhaps the buying power argument. Given that kind of split in my head, I said, well, all right, well, let's just run a scenario here where we split the difference. Aquarian's saying it's 2.2, the town is saying 3, comparable to itself. Here's 2.6. So when we run through this case, we're keeping the 98% rate realization rate, and we're going to 1.94% on the spread. You see in row 9, as you might expect, a little bit worse than scenario 1 because we're making a meaningful shift in Aquarian's cost structure through their economics or economies of scale. But then again, as you roll down the assumptions in through row 13, row 16, and row 18, you see that depending on what your view is on those Hingham assumptions, again, and I haven't changed the value of the Hingham assumptions across all 4 scenarios, you still end up, if you subscribe to the town's view, in a positive scenario from a customer billing perspective. And now for the final analysis, if you turn to page 4, you will see the identical graph from page 3 showing all 4 scenarios. And again, these numbers at the end of the columns track with the numbers on that page. It's just a graphical representation that shows you, and again, as before, in the far left is just the straight-up Aquarian assessment or estimate under the Aquarian baseline assumptions. And then in each step, as you move left to right, you add one of the Hingham assumptions, and the magnitude of that assumption's impact is highlighted in the far right column in each section in the less dark blue. And again, as I pointed out before, it bears repeating one last time. Aquarian costs in this model based on Aquarian's model, not Anderson's model of Aquarian's costs. And embedded in all of these Hingham costs until year 31 are the costs of buying the facility. And in year 31, a material drop in the expense to the customer bill as the acquisition debt is discharged. One last thing, just to comment quickly on the documents we got today, and none of us had a whole lot of time to look at these, so let me just make a couple quick comments about this. I think I'm now looking at Bloom's letter from March 6th today. This is the Bloom letter as opposed to the Aquarian letter. A lot of the discussion in that one has to do with the Anderson tax view of the Aquarian borrowing costs, and as I mentioned at the top, that's not relevant to my analysis, I don't believe, because I use the Aquarian spreadsheet to get these numbers. At some point down the line, if we're going to have a conversation around these inflation rate differentials, if they're material, I think it would be really useful for us to have more information about the basis for that assertion. Conceptually, it computes at some level, just the magnitude is unclear. Interestingly enough, while I appreciate Bloom's analysis on the equity cost differential, I was actually being more critical, not critical, I was critiquing the Anderson model's view, which is the one that had the converging equity and debt costs, which I found to be odd. The Aquarian model has always had a relative spread between the two, and so I appreciate the analysis they did. The sensitivity was less important because I thought it was on the Anderson side. Again, I've talked about the rate case realization. The prevailing wage, we've heard, treatment plant lease expense, and I think that's it.
There's also
Question?
just looking at the other letter, they talked about the lease, the wages, and then the other one, they've got the property taxes.
Yeah, and
So it seems like there's a question there.
Yeah, and I will say that as far as Mr. Walsh's letter, I didn't have enough time to think all that through. I mean, TBD, what that impact is. I just don't have enough. I didn't have enough time to think it through.
Yeah, 'cause that's definitely something that would have to be adjusted, and then I'm not sure if this is a question for Ed, but because I think you sent us the follow-up on the property tax email, and the 580 that was from the rate case, wouldn't that be for 2016, which was the test year? The 580 for the water treatment plant property taxes?
I believe that's correct.
Okay, so if it's for 2016, then that's also something that has to be adjusted in the town's model, because that's, right now, I think it's reflected in 2018, but if the model's gonna start at, it's gotta be, grown by the 3%, just to make it a current number, because I think the analysis right now is using an old.
So how does that affect Dave's analysis?
Well, Dave's analysis is doing this, taking the Aquarian number and then adjusting it. So I think when we're comparing the two, I think we just have to adjust the town one too, so that initial, if you look at his spreadsheet, which this is the first time I'm seeing any of the stuff that Dave did tonight, so I haven't seen any of it ahead of time. But I would assume that where it would play into would be line 6, where the initial presumption is that the town's, the cost of town
Well, put it this way, if,
which would be row 6 in scenario 1. So whatever changes we would,
I'll tell you this much, if you take the page 2 of Mr. Walsh's letter and you,
which one, because there's let me see.
well, there's only
Let me,
one from Mr.
one Walsh, let me see.
it's the one with the Aquarian header.
Yep, okay, page 2.
Page
Yep.
2 of Mr.
Yep.
Walsh's letter, if you, and I'm not opining as to the merits of this, but if you believe that that Hingham's model, as by the way, as Aquarian presented it in their first letter,
Yeah.
understates Hingham's ownership cost by the $6,083,743. Let's take that as a fact, even though I don't know the answer. That would be a $15.40 impact per connection per year. So, and if we wanted to apply that just right now in our heads,
Yeah, I think.
you know, deduct $15.40 off of every value in table 4 or in graph 4, and that would give you that. And again, I'm not condoning that. I don't know. I haven't had a chance to think about this and haven't heard the town's view on this analysis. But that's the order of magnitude of Mr. Walsh's, of that one assumption. That's all.
Yeah, I guess all I'm trying to say is if we're gonna make, take scenarios with the Aquarian one, then we just need to make sure we're bringing this together and making sure that we're comfortable with where the town's number is, so that when it comes into that scenario 1, our starting point makes sense. And I think that this reference here is only for the distribution. Is that correct, Mr. Walsh? This is just the distribution taxes?
Yes.
So, yes, what the 226,000.
Oh.
John Walsh, Vice President of Operations for Aquarian. So on that table where, in the column year 0, where it says $226,230, that is actually, it's a number in, that's for payroll taxes. I think it's described in the paragraph above. So someone just grabbed the wrong number. They grabbed the payroll tax line item, payroll and excise tax line item number, and put it in for the distribution system taxes. There are 2 line items that they're right next to each other
Okay.
in a spreadsheet. So someone just grabbed the wrong number and put it into the town's model.
All right, so 2 questions on that, and I know it looks like Mr. Siegfried might have something to add on that, but because I know I pulled up the rate case on DPU's website, and I mean there was 54 pages of the real estate bills, so I was trying to differentiate. It's easy to see the distribution system bills that relate to the non-water water treatment plant because they're not Hingham ones, but so. And we'll get some counterpoint on the 226, but are you saying that the proper number on that is 344?
Correct.
Okay, and then just going back to the treatment plant, so that 580, that's from the 2016 rate case, we're gonna need to roll that forward to get to a 2019 number and forward, correct?
That I'm not familiar with.
Okay, because that's on, I
And we
have
can
it,
get back to you on that, definitely.
yeah, I mean, I have a copy of the rate case and it shows that, I could show you at some point, but yeah, I just wanted to make sure we have the right numbers going forward, because they, when you take them over 30 years, it adds up, so, okay. I appreciate the answer to that. Oh, yeah, did you wanna,
Libby,
yeah.
other comments before?
No, well, I think it might as well keep on the same topic, don't you think, to have,
So you have additional points, though, to?
a couple,
Okay.
yeah,
All right, Mr. Siegfried, go ahead.
yeah, just to keep our
Siegfried,
topics.
With respect to the distribution system property taxes, the document I'm referring to is from DPU 1790, the recent rate case. The document dated August 10th, 2018, Exhibit 2, Schedule 25, page 1 of 3. And it's entitled Property Taxes, Adjustment to Real Estate Tax and Personal Property Taxes is based on annualizing the July 2018 property tax bills received by the company. The following adjustment does not include property taxes associated with the Hingham treatment plant, and it lists the property taxes: the town of Cohasset, the distribution property taxes, town of Cohasset, town of Hingham, town of Hull, town of Millbury, which has been excluded, town of Norwell, town of Oxford, which has been excluded, town of Rockland, and motor vehicles. And then property taxes total for those communities, $226,230. There's nothing
Can-
about payroll taxes.
Can I just see that, Ed? Is that from the DPU case? Because the reference that I think you sent, when I pulled up the attachment, this is what it was, and it was, so that's great. If you have this, then I'd love a copy of that, because that's,
That's distribution property taxes, right straight from the DPU website.
yeah, because the reference you gave, when I pulled it up, it was actually just individual bills. So if I can get a copy, that'd be awesome, because I couldn't find it on the, and then.
Mr. Walsh is incorrect when he's talking about payroll taxes and excise taxes. Clearly, or they've misrepresented their case to the DPU, because the DPU has classified these as distribution system property taxes.
One quick comment, sure.
We will gladly check that. I know from what I was shown by our financial people in the models, not what Mr. Siegfried is referring to. It showed that number, but if there is an error there, we will make sure we correct it, definitely.
Compared to the schedule that's being referred to. I guess.
Exactly. So we'll get back to the committee.
Yep.
Because I want to look at that myself. But if we made a mistake in this letter, we will get a correction back to you.
Okay, thank you. Libby, other?
And then again, like I said, I can't respond specifically to this because I haven't seen it before tonight, but just in some scenarios I was running through as far as, I know that it's been stated that at least for the first couple years, that the water rates are gonna stay the same. And I know that the initial budget for the enterprise fund shows that kicking off a surplus. So I wonder, going forward, is there a target range that's been established? And I'm not sure who this question
Well-
is for.
Talk to the board right now.
Yeah,
Many.
so I just wonder if there's a target range for what that annual rate increase will be. And conversely, that translates also into what would be this, I guess they call it really like a revenue budget surplus. So whether that's considered a water rate stabilization fund or a CapEx reserve account, how that rate fluctuates will, over time,
Affect
increase, that sort of either rate stabilization fund or that capital reserve account. And so just kind of running through scenarios where I look at the rates, I get different answers depending certainly on what those rates are, but I think they've indicated that the intent wouldn't be to keep the rate increases at what Aquarian has, which is about 3.3% per year. Those are sort of big
So
drivers,
right,
if you
so-
will, to what the enterprise fund is gonna look like as far as financially.
All right, so I guess, so your point is, depending on how much they're putting aside, that will affect the cost figures in town ownership line items that Dave's looking at is?
It wouldn't
This is a
impact
different
it's a different point. It wouldn't impact the cost figures. I mean, what's on here now, needs to be corrected for the property tax number, which may or may not be,
Right,
I
right.
do think
That would
is
affect.
fairly
right.
material over the 30 years, but let's just accept at this point that they are what they are. I'm saying that the annual increase in the water rates, let me start off with the rates that they have set for year one, if you look, because they kick off a $4.8 million surplus, the rates are exceeding the cost.
Right.
But at some point, I guess depending on what I just created a cash flow and able to just change what that increase would be year over year, and depending on what the plan is to how, if we're gonna keep the rates the same for 2 years, then I know they've said they're not gonna reduce the rates, but they wouldn't go up as much as they would go up with Aquarian. Well, if 3.3 is what they would go up with Aquarian, then if they're, what is that target that they have for that? And then the consequence of that is what this reserve account rate stabilization / capital reserve account would be looking at, like what the number would be.
So you mean if it's going up higher, depending on what the rate of
Yeah.
increase is, the delta between the actual cost and the revenue is gonna be higher or less, right, in each given year, and that would either
Yeah.
increase or decrease the the reserve fund or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, to the extent that your rates exceed the costs. And, I mean, there could be, you know, on average, it looks like it goes anywhere from, after the first year, it could be, you know, 1.3 or 4 million, and then it goes down to 1.3. At this point, is assuming like well, the first 2 years, the rates have been kept the same. But then, you know, then the question becomes, what is the, you know, what is the intention with that surplus each year? Is it to create a reserve account for the future if there's some unknown problem? Is it to ultimately pass that on back to the ratepayers, which is, you know, I think one of the intents was that with, they say Aquarion's rates being 23% higher than the state's average, so then is the goal to reduce rates rather than to have this make a profit?
Or is it an accelerated capital reserve or something?
Yeah, or just, yeah, adding to the reserve. Thanks, Michelle. So,
Okay.
and those, you know, and that plays into, you know, the enterprise fund budget. And I think, also, you know, that's gonna change if the O&M costs end up being higher than anticipated.
Yes. Please. Yep.
Good evening, Mary Power for the Board of Selectmen. Here's what's going on with water rates, and here's what's going on. And so for year one, the plan for the town is that we will keep the rates as they are right now. In year one only. And the town has been very consistent on that. And our position has been misrepresented. But that is our position in year one. And the reason that we're doing that in year one is because what it gives us the ability to do is to, as Ms. Claypool mentioned, establish a revenue surplus that's approximately $4.8 million. And, you know, you've heard people talk about potential, you know, doomsday scenarios, about unexpected issues. And we've also heard some concern from members of this committee and others about the potential of, you know, if even in the short term, if there was an issue, how do we ensure that this enterprise fund doesn't have to ask the town of Hingham for some funds to cover any sort of a short-term issue? So keeping rates the same in year one only gives us the ability to achieve a revenue surplus of about $4.8 million. That will remain in the enterprise fund. That will remain in the enterprise fund, and it will only be used for water. And there are other people who are more familiar with the enterprise fund and how it's set up, but I think even if we wanted to take it out of the enterprise fund, I don't think we could.
Yeah, you can't.
And the thought in year one is that there will be a lot of experience that we get. So rather than establish and put it into a capital stabilization fund, or establish and put it into a rate stabilization fund, with guidance from the town treasurer, our thought is, let's keep that as a liquid item so that it has maximum flexibility. We can certainly establish stabilization funds for capital and for rates. Those can certainly happen. As we're all aware, those require a vote of town meeting. Town meeting has to vote to put the money in. Town meeting has to vote to take the money out. It is our intent in year one to engage in two important studies that will inform what will happen in years 2 and beyond. The first one, and I believe Mr. Asher may have spoken about it, is a capital improvement study. When Hingham purchases the water company, we will inherit all the existing capital studies. But the most recent one that we're aware of that's very specific is about 2014. And so we would certainly want to engage in a capital study that is more current and that would build on the ones that are existing. At that same time, what we would want to do is establish what's called a cost of service study. And when we've gone to other communities who have purchased their water system, one of the things that they've done very early on is a cost of service study that informs future rates. And so in that first year, as we would as those two studies would occur, that would inform the decision. I can tell you a couple things. First of all, we're not going to bill people for more than what it costs to run the system. We're not going to do that. We're gonna bill for what it costs to run the system, and to the extent that and to the extent that we do have this surplus, again, we have the ability to, could that mean that rates are going up, that the savings, if you will, does that mean that rates potentially are going up slower and to a lesser degree? It could be that. Does it mean that we're able to accelerate capital investment beyond the $2.7 million per year that's contemplated in a model? We could potentially do that too. Or we could do a combination. We could absolutely do a combination. And our thought is, let's, in year one, do the studies, which Hingham is very good at doing. Let's get those studies, let's get that information and decide what happens. And so, again, in year one, the rates will remain the same, cost of service study, capital study, and we are only going to bill ratepayers for what it costs to run the system. So I hope that addresses the question. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just mentioned that about the first 2 years because that was my recollection from one of our, I don't know if it was our first or second meeting, that you had said for the first couple years it was going to stay the same. And actually the enterprise fund budget that was sent out to us is it shows 2 years, and those 2 years have the same revenue for those 2 years. So it doesn't show a decrease. It shows it staying the same for 2 years because there's year one and year two on this. So anyway, so that's why I asked about that, because it does, the thing we got, the
All right,
spreadsheet
so
we got emailed showed too.
Your question, what you were referring to is from the enterprise budget.
Right, that we
yeah.
received.
Okay.
And then, and so then the question was, okay, after that, what's the plan as far as, how much it would go up if,
Okay,
and by what percent?
okay. Other questions or comments on Dave or Dave's analysis?
No, I mean,
or-
I'd like to look at his
Sure.
information more closely. I mean, well, one thing I know that I'd be curious about that is in your analysis, Dave, and then looking at the letter we got from Bloom about the lease. Let me just look in on their sheet here. They note that it's similar to the, if the town bought the water company at some point. This is about the water treatment plant. So after, my recollection from reading it is after 2036, from their standpoint, it's paid off, so there would no longer be any cost for that. So I wonder, let's see here, yeah, it's on page, well, they're not numbered, under the treatment plant lease portion. So the amount that you have on here, the 9776, they're saying that after, lease expires after 2025. And it says Aquarion's model assumes 1 year of the debt repayment of $1.4 million, just rounding, in 2036. So as far as the Aquarian model then didn't include anything after 2036? So should that be a variance on your spreadsheet? Because
Well,
Aquarion's saying there won't be any more lease payment because they've fully paid off the debt.
No, I understand what Aquarion's saying.
So I'm saying on yours, would that still need to be here, or should it?
Well, two answers. Mine presents the magnitude of it, and you can keep it or drop it in reaching a conclusion. The only thing I'll say is, all I can say is what Mr. Ryan said last week, which
Yeah.
is that as strongly as Aquarion feels that they don't have to pay it, the town's analysis from a legal perspective is that they do. So I wouldn't look to this paragraph as being dispositive on the matter. There's debate. So I'm not going to opine on this. I don't have any idea. I'm listening to, an attorney tell us that it must be paid, and I'm listening to other attorneys, I suppose, saying it doesn't.
Okay. So
I'm
that's a
telling you
debate
that the total cost of that is, to this impact, is $24 a year per connection. So do you want to take half? Do you want to take zero? Do you want to take it all? I don't know what to tell you, but that's,
Okay, I
that's
just wanted to
kinda
ask
where I am.
about that and how it impacted your.
My understanding, and this is very cursory, is that there may be, there is some limited extension rights to the lease, but also there may be benefit from Aquarian standpoint in renewing the lease. Whether that's accurate or not, whether they would actually act on that, but they do get financial benefit from that in their rate cases.
And wasn't there a number in the Anderson model where it was like 500,000 or something, like a sort of floor of going forward
I don't remember.
on that? Okay, yeah, I
Well,
think it was on one of their slides. I'll have to
My,
go back and look.
my
at it.
savings here is based on Aquarian's analysis of the delta. So this, I'm not relying on, I'm relying on Aquarian's analysis of the delta, and I would assert that Aquarian's analysis of the delta will be one that is at worst, you know, most fair to Aquarian. So I don't think we're being, in taking Aquarian's number for this delta, I think we're taking a reasonable number, and we can certainly ask more questions about the basis for this
Oh, yeah, no, I
assessment.
just wanted to talk about that line item so we were kind of clear on what that, you know, pros and cons of it.
Jim Taylor's looking for recognition.
Oh,
I think that's it for now.
okay, Bob or Aaron, at this point, any?
Well, very briefly, I just want to thank Dave for the time and effort that he put into presenting this information and the clarity that you did it with. And my only question, I think, is in terms of an operational expense relative to property taxes, isn't it a wash no matter what? Because Aquarian's going to pay tax, and if the town buys it, they're going to pay a pilot. And
My understanding of the issue at being debated here is not that, because you're right. I think everyone agrees that the town is indifferent to the ownership from a tax revenue standpoint. The town would be. The question is, does the model accurately reflect what the tax bill will
Right.
be? That I think is the issue. I'm not opining on it. I'm just telling you, I think that's my understanding of the question that's being
okay,
debated.
well, my understanding level is here, and your,
No, I mean, I would put,
No, it's
the
totally,
delta is significant.
yeah, it's agnostic as far as the numbers, no matter who owns it. It's just right now a question of, in an effort to maintain this apples-to-apples analysis and to truly look at what the town's cost would be, we just want to make sure that we've got the right numbers, because there's, you know, at a minimum, the water treatment we're going to adjust.
And that's all I have.
At the moment. Mr. Taylor?
Hi, thank you, Dave, great work. Thank you for this sensitivity analysis. I did have a couple questions on it, though, if you don't mind.
fire away.
If you could go to page 2, your assumptions around the bond
Yeah.
expense. I may have found a slight issue.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, and that's on the current, the 10-year treasury is 269, which is today. And you said the current AAA muni rate would be 285. That's actually for a 20-year muni.
Oh, sorry.
Presently, a 10-year muni is a 210 as of today, which actually increases the spread
It's the spread.
significantly, well above 194. So I think you'll find that that changes your numbers fairly significantly.
It'd be interesting that changed, because Dave, on that call with bond council last Thursday, they gave us a rate of, I think it was 295 for a 30-year AAA muni.
Right,
I
he's
don't know how it got from 295 to 2.1 today.
2.1 is a 10-year. So Dave used a 20-year muni
Yeah.
rate instead of the 10-year. And what, typical bond, especially,
Right.
It's been Aquarian's history that they've actually refinanced with 10 years. They asserted today, I just saw the letter, half an hour ago, that actually they could actually extend that. I think a good role to look at is Eversource actually refinanced in December of this year, and they refinanced through a 10-year bond, as Aquarian did in their last refinancing, which occurred in 2011. So I think that's actually probably more indicative of what you can expect moving forward.
So, Jim, so you said that it's the 20-year AAA muni that's 2.1?
No, the
20-year?
10-year.
10-year.
Yeah, so,
Okay.
so Dave, what Dave was comparing was the spread between 10-year treasury
Yeah.
and 10-year muni,
I just want to see what you were saying the 2.1 was.
which is
the
closer to
10-year.
50-plus basis points today. So that's going to change your model. The second question I have is around assumptions around CapEx borrowing rates for Aquarian. Now, in the Blum-Shapiro model, what they're doing is they're projecting out what they anticipate the 10-year rate will be in 2022. And they use this economic forecast that, 10 out of 8 economists predicted the last recession or some crazy number where no one actually can predict interest rates with any sort of accuracy. But let's assume that their model's correct. And then let's assume that, in fact, this forecast system is accurate in forecasting rates. And if so, we should also look at the town's borrowing rate for the purchase, right? So you can't just kind of cherry pick rates and say there's going to be a lower rate for Aquarian to finance CapEx, yet the town's going to continue to purchase at a 375 rate as in their model. So what I did is I looked at that economic tool and I looked to see what a 30-year borrowing rate would be in 2020, which would be around the time that the town would actually finance a long-term debt. And they were predicting the 30-year rate would be around 265. So more than 1 point below. So you either do an apples to apples or you don't. But I think that if you're going to assume that Aquarian can borrow at a lower rate, you also have to apply that to the town's purchase, which in fact is the largest expense by far the system will experience for the next 30 years. Another point I wanted to make is around the interest rates, is around expense assumptions. So Aquarian, the Blum-Shapiro model asserted that they anticipated that the inflation rate for the cost was going to be a 2.2% increase, if I remember correctly.
Plum Shapiro said 3, but Aquarian said 2.2.
Right, right. But they had a sensitivity analysis showing the difference between
today's
2 and
letter.
3. And I think today's letter even asserted more. Again, I read it for 2 seconds. So I actually looked to their source material they used. They used a different economic forecasting system to try to determine what the future inflation rate. And that's where they got that 2.2 is around the CPI, estimated CPI rate of inflation. So the only trouble with using that rate is that CPI, and that's the rate that they pointed to, and in fact, that's the rate that the Aquarian model back in the fall pointed to too, is that it excludes one key factor. It doesn't include the cost of energy in that forecast. So if you really were to include potentially future rate increases around energy, I would think 3% is probably more of an appropriate model to use. So I was disappointed they
When Jim, if
they
I
chose
might
not
on
to
that
use
one
that.
point, I mean, I hear you, and I would say that I think what I was trying to capture in scenario 4 with the 2.6 versus
Yeah.
the 3 was not a debate about the appropriate forecast, but was whatever the inflation rate is, Aquarian's asserting Aquarian's asserting an 80 basis point delta
Right.
due to their leverage and their buying power, and
Right.
we can buy cheaper. Again, I said there's no
Yeah.
data to support that. That's an assertion. 2.6, just to be able to test the hypothesis that if there was a delta, what's its impact?
I'm glad you did that because the other point around it is that, if you look at their employment contracts, they have built-in escalations of, I believe in their current contracts of 3% for both their union and non-union employees. So it'd be very difficult to have costs increasing by 2.2% a year when your labor expense is increasing by 3% a year. And then the last point I saw in the Blum question today was around the financing of the entire project. They were questioning why Anderson, not Dave, Anderson was refinancing with a 29-year term. It's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that a project can be financed for 30 years. So the town is anticipating using bands for the first year, then for the remaining of the term using long-term debt. So that actual long-term debt issuance would be for a 29-year term, not for an additional 30 years. So anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Mr. Asher.
Jonathan Asher, 5 Common Street. Again, having just received the cover letter and Blum-Shapiro report shortly before the meeting tonight, but I noticed that on page 3, it says, we believe the subcommittee should consider whether the town's typical financing practices have been assumed in the Anderson tax model. And
noticed
I
that.
think this was a subject of some discussion last week. I have since talked with the town treasurer collector at some length and have been assured that the town's financing practices are to minimize the town's cost whenever possible, that the model, the long-term debt model for 29 years, represents to the town's treasurer collector a worst-case scenario in terms of the cost, and then in fact through the use of bond premiums or some extended short-term borrowing, that in fact the total cost over the 29 years or 28 plus would be less than represented in the model.
Did you get into that point that I think was made in the, if I understood it right, in the Blum-Shapiro letter, the difference between paying at the end of the year versus the
Right.
beginning of the year?
Right. And that's the point that the town treasurer collector was making, that in fact, as Libby said, if you look at level payment borrowing 29-year term with payment at the beginning of the term, in fact, the first payment is a pure principal payment with no interest.
Right.
So the town treasurer collector calls that a pay down, and then it's just a question of, is there sufficient money to pay the 6.17 million that represents the first payment? And she assured me that through a combination of bond premiums, the short-term borrowing on top of the one-year ban, that the answer was yes.
So John, just to be absolutely clear, you're suggesting then that on page 3 at the bottom table there, that what's referred to as the variance to the Anderson model of 9.543 is not meaningful.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I agree with that, by the way, because that payment is a payment computed at the beginning of the period, so. And I think that's how Jean said the town does it.
Dave, so we've had some discussion in the past about whether, you know, well, I guess it was last week, the MRAM is at 2%, and there's, I guess, a motion for reconsideration to raise it to 3%. How does that affect your numbers or the analysis at all, if the 3 were granted?
Well, would you mind could I ask a question of Mr. Walsh if he's available?
Sure, if
And
he's
forgive me,
willing
this
to.
is my lack of understanding of MRAM. When looking at the model, I note that there is a 2% MRAM surcharge built into the model as I saw it. And then there's a little note next door that says a request is in for a 3% surcharge. And I'm just trying to clarify, to answer Victor's question, if you're granted a 3% surcharge, does that change the amount of capital expenditure that you make, or does it just change your recovery rate for the same amount of CapEx in both 2 and 3%?
It's the latter.
It is the same
changes.
CapEx, quicker recovery.
Correct.
So a front-loading of expense to the ratepayer for no change in CapEx.
Correct. The CapEx doesn't change.
Right, okay.
So it means in any given year, if we spend capital that would equate to a 2.5% MRAM surcharge in the following year, with the current approved MRAM program, it would be limited to a 2% MRAM surcharge in the following year. The remainder would be included in the following general rate case.
Okay. So just to be clear, just to make sure I got it right, Aquarium would make no change in your capital budgeting or capital expenditures, whether that's a 2 or 3% decision from the DPU.
Correct. I don't think we'd make a change.
Okay. So I guess, Victor, to answer your question then, my understanding from the model would be that the aggregate cost, and correct me if I'm wrong, as you understand it, Mr. Walsh, the aggregate cost would probably be unchanged in those two scenarios, a 2 or 3% recovery. But on a time value basis or a present value basis, it would probably be a higher cost because the ratepayers would, in essence, reimburse through the MRAM at an earlier date. Does that sound fair?
Correct.
No? Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to talk it through out loud.
Did you have a point, Libby?
Oh, no, well, I was just gonna say, I think I think that cap, whether it's 2.2 and it goes up to 3, that's an annual cap on the MRAM sort of
Yeah.
base, right? It's the base, which has a formula, right, for the annual?
I'm not sure I followed that.
Okay, that's all right, never
Sorry.
mind. Let's not get too deep into MRAM.
Thank you. Mr. Edge?
MRAM. A series of documents were transmitted to the town on Friday associated with the MRAM report for 2019 and the supporting documentation for it. So there's documentation now in the public record. What I'm citing from is Exhibit AWC DAS 4. And it is a projection of the customer bill impact of the MRAM at 2%. And you're correct. The 2% isn't at the bill level, it's at the water revenue level and the growth.
It's like the MRAM base, right?
Correct.
And John, where did this information come from?
From the Director of Rates and Regulations.
Oh, from Aquarian?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So using that exhibit, basically, if you go back to the tie and bond average bill here in Hingham prior to the DPU 1790 rate case approval by the DPU, that average bill was $730. Using this exhibit, what you can see is that at 2%, the existing approved MRAM annual cap, that bill by fiscal year 2022 would increase to $857 per year. If the 3% cap request is approved and applies to all of the submissions for the plans to date, that $857 would become $875. So $730 to either $857 average or $875 average based on the AWC DAS 4 exhibit.
So that's the annual bill.
Correct.
Going back to Dave's question in terms of the ultimate costs on capital and...
Yeah, this is just the bill impact. This is not, I mean, just based on what Mr. Walsh said, this doesn't imply increased CapEx expenditure. It implies increased return to Aquarian in order that they can hit the threshold that we discussed last week, the 1.25 miles linear feet per year to qualify for MRAM in that year.
So John, just to follow up on that, kind of getting back to the same question I asked, if you summed up 30 years of bills under MRAM 2% and MRAM 3%, would the sum of the 30-year bills be equivalent?
No, I think they would be higher with the 3% than the 2%.
You do, okay.
That's why the delta here.
Okay, so it's not a timing question. You're asserting that it's
I think I think it's more than timing, and I would encourage you to look at this exhibit just based on your analysis and see if you agree with the analysis I did.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Walsh, quickly.
We'd be glad to provide you information that shows that 30-year impact, but you are correct. It just changes the timing, and it changes it by a couple years. What's not reflected, I don't think, in what Mr. Asher was just speaking about is, at some point there's a general rate case. So if the cap is at 2% and our capital spending is would be beyond a limit of 2%, that additional cost gets captured in our next general rate case. So over the span of the 30-year, well, to put it your way, it just moves the timing up for the capital investments.
Okay. Well, we'll do some more work on that. But I guess, Victor, to answer your question, my assessment would be, even splitting the difference between those two views, my numbers are based on a 2% MRAM surcharge. I think that's what's baked into the model, assuming that's in the model. It looks like it is in the model. If it was to go to a 3% surcharge, if you take John's view, it would be a higher cost, and if you take Mr. Walsh's view, it would be the same cost, same total cost. So in other words, a 3% surcharge does nothing to make these numbers look worse for Hingham. They could look better for Hingham if, in fact, they are more than just timing, and we can do some work.
Is another way to look at it too, that just say you have this much MRAM, if the cap is 2.2 and say it's here, and there's some that's sort of unrecoverable, if the cap moves up, of course, if the cap's 3% and the prior one was 2.2, over the course of 30 years, the 3% cap, if you add it up, is going to be a larger number than the 2.2. But then, I know you said it would get captured in the next rate case, but I thought that, is it Barry Dunn. I don't know if it was that lady from Barry Dunn that had said that starts back at 0, though. Am I thinking of something else, or wasn't it MRAM, or is that what starts back
think
at
it's
0
MRAM
at the next
starts
rate
at 0.
case? I might be misspeaking, but I thought that's what one of the
I believe that's what she said, yep.
consultants said. But, so I think the 3% cap is gonna have to be more than 2.2. Doesn't mean that, that's capturing 100% of MRAM. It's just capturing, that portion that they're allowed to recoup, so.
Okay, one last point on this point.
Having spent some time with MRAM, it's 2%, so it's not 2.2. And there's an annual cap and a cap within the rate case, so there are 2 caps. The 2% is a cap per year.
Right.
The 10% cap, the DPU did approve. So it's just a question of how many years
Right.
between rate
cases.
increase requests are, and if in fact, as Mr. Walsh was saying just a minute ago, if in fact in a particular year the 2% cap were to be exceeded, Aquarian can recover that in a successive year. In other words, it moves forward. There's a reconciliation portion to the formula for the calculation of the MRAM factor.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Yes, go
Just
ahead,
as a
sure.
quick question on that. Assuming town ownership, doesn't this whole concept of MRAM go out the window because of the town rate-setting process?
Yeah.
Mary Power from Board of Selectmen. I would say 2 things. First of all, under town ownership, we don't need an MRAM surcharge to do the necessary capital improvements to the system. So by virtue of that, it would not occur in the bills.
Thanks.
So just to touch on a couple of the financial things before we switch over to governance, sort of commenting on a couple of points I raised at the beginning. So on the bonding question, remind the committee, we have an opinion from bond counsel, the town has an opinion from bond counsel that general obligation bonds are appropriate. We have information from, in fact, I think I'll ask Libby to speak further on this, from Capital Markets Advisory, the town advisor, as to the lack of impact on credit rating, and I believe you had conversations with CMA. Well, you and Dave have had conversations.
Yeah, I think they, do you want to finish going through?
No,
those?
so,
Okay.
I mean, it was the gist that the credit rating would not be adversely affected by this type of borrowing the size of this borrowing, because those concerns have been raised from some people who we've gotten communications from.
Yeah, I haven't gone back and looked at my notes since we had the call, but Dave, I think that was what they had said too, that it wouldn't impact the total debt, credit
Won't
limit
affect
for
the
the town.
cap, and it won't affect the rating, and they've been discussing it with investors over the years as a potential future activity or action by the town.
Okay.
And they did indicate that there's been both revenue and GO bonds used for these kind of purchases, so it wasn't like it's just, the GO's the only way to go. I think the main reason they were recommending that is because it has a lower rate, and it has, to the town, obviously, the GO bond rate is lower than it would be on a revenue bond, and the revenue bond has initial, I guess you could call it like reserve requirements that would need to be met, that would result, I believe, in sort of more debt having to be taken out to, so I think it's really an economic reason that we didn't go that route.
That you go with the general obligation bond.
And the fact that it would also have to go to the legislature to get approval to issue the revenue bond, because the town can't do that right now. So it seems like it was mostly an economic decision, because they said both have been done in different communities. So it wasn't.
All right, but
like
the
slam
general
dunk.
obligation approach is obviously appropriate. That's,
Well, it's what they're recommending.
that's what they recommend,
Yeah.
sure.
Mr. Chairman, may I address?
That point?
Yes,
Sure.
briefly. Richard Pedoni, 12 Newtown Drive, Counsel for Aquarian. So the opinion that the town has obtained on the permissibility of general obligation bonds is what I would describe in the corporate transactions I do, as a summary opinion. When you read it, it doesn't look like the type of legal opinion the town could rely upon. And I'd suggest that an approach the committee could take is actually suggest that before the town goes to town meeting, an opinion the town could rely on this issue be obtained, so that there's certainty that we don't take a vote and then can't get through the bond process. So the comment was made that general obligation bonds have been used for this purpose. We can't identify any instance where one town has used general obligation bonds to buy an asset in another town. So the opinion that you could obtain would say, such and such town did it, therefore it's permissible, and the firm would stand behind the opinion. So I would suggest that's an alternative.
So when the statute says that the town has the right to acquire the assets, and clearly the statute understood that they were in multiple towns, you feel that that's still raises a question as to the type of bonding that can be used?
I do. So when you read the charter has a very, very specific type of financing that can be used with limits on payments that can be made. The legislature thought through how can Hingham borrow, and they spelled it out with exquisite detail. So the summary opinion doesn't say the town was authorized to borrow in this way and the town will borrow in that way. The opinion says the town can borrow, the charter provides you can borrow, and then it goes on to say you can do general obligation bonds. It does not address the issue of how the legislature spoke to that very specific issue. But then, when you pass the bonding statutes that say how you can bond in later years, ignored this particular issue. So when they pass the other statutes later that say you can borrow, issue general obligation bonds, they don't say Hingham can continue to borrow for this purpose. So we have a charter that describes a process, which is clearly permissible, but that's not what the town's using. And I think the way to address it is a very clear reliance opinion from council. And then we would know the question, and council would address it in depth as opposed to the summary opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, just bear with me. Okay. Let's turn to governance. So this overlaps articles NN and OL, but obviously governance ties into the basic decision of whether it makes sense to acquire the company or not. NN proposes the Board of Selectmen to act as water commissioners. Aaron and Bob, do you want to sort of take us through whatever research you've done and how other communities may have approached this?
Can I request just a moment to pull up
Sure.
some materials? How would you like to approach this since we don't have materials printed out? I mean,
I think a discussion, I mean, if you can summarize what you've found. I
Sure.
don't think we need to go through each community, but a general, give the committee here a sense for what.
Sure. I mean, I think it's fair to say that there, and Bob, please feel free to throw in as well. It's fair to say that there are many towns that have elected officials, mayors or Board of Selectmen, that are acting as water commissioners. That seemed quite common. It is less common for towns to outsource their operations and maintenance to third parties. More often than not, communities are running their own municipal water. However, if you look at our 41 town cohort, I want to say off the top of my head, there's 5 or 6 that are using outsourced O&M providers. I'm trying to think what else would be important from a nutshell standpoint. Is there anything else you would add?
Well, I agree with, my research on the 41 communities is basically the same as yours, Aaron, that almost all cities and towns with similarly situated water companies, the governance is in the executive branch of government, either the mayor or the board of selectmen, and most often it would appear that the water company is within the Department of Public Works, and most often run by town employees. I understand we're in a transitional period, and maybe somewhere down the road after a learning process occurs, there would be a synergy to be achieved by looking at different ways to do that. I started looking at Article NN from the viewpoint of the statute that permits or that governs how a water company is to be governed. And I have a very preliminary draft of a comment and recommendation. And I know the question has been raised about whether the Board of Selectmen should act as water commissioners or whether we should have separate elected water commissioners. And it would appear at this juncture that there really is only one option, and that is for the Board of Selectmen to act as water commissioners, largely because to have an election, you have to do other things that the time frame simply doesn't permit under this present scenario. So while it might be that down the road, again, after whatever learning process happens, the town might want to look at whether they would like to have separate elected water commissioners apart from the Board of Selectmen. That's an option, but it's not really a present option. It also, from the 41 communities we've looked at, does not seem to be an option that other communities have gone for. I think I could only find in a water district, not a city or town, that of the 41 communities, I think I only identified one where there were separate elected water commissioners, and that was where there was a water district. So I think that's the way I approached it, looking at the statute and the options that were present and the wisdom that's available from what other cities and towns have done.
Thank you. Now, some of our, some of the criticisms that I think we've heard voiced at some of our meetings and in some of the communications we've received, that the Board of Selectmen are not expert in this area, and also that they have too much on their plate. Some say it's, perhaps because there are only 3 of them or whatever, all the capital projects facing the town. We've also heard comments that from folks from South Hingham that the Board of Selectmen might have conflicts in that they might favor extending water service to promote development in portions of town that residents don't want, and perhaps private ownership or water commissioners would take a different view of. So those, have been some of the countervailing approaches. I mean, I think on the expertise issue, I think that's a little misplaced because, they're clearly not going to be doing the day-to-day operations. They're either going to be hiring someone in the current model, or else in what you're suggesting, Bob, down the road, they would have professional employees within the town doing that. We did hear from the sewer commissioner at our 2 or 3 hearings ago that it's quite a straightforward exercise to set rates from a non-expert sewer commission board members, and they rely on engineering advice, and it's really pretty much an exercise in making sure your revenues and expenses match. So I don't think that's a big issue, but it has been raised. I'd like to, raise for the committee's consideration the idea that, and I sort of agree with you, Bob, that for the first year, certainly, there's really no option. I mean, the selectmen have been really into this, and we don't have time for an election and what have you. And I believe that under the statute, they are the default water commissioners in any event, even if they weren't chosen officially. If there were no one chosen, then it would default to the Board of Selectmen. What I would suggest for the committee's consideration is the idea of having selectmen as water commissioners for 1-2 years, but at the same time have a town moderator appointed committee to review the question and report to town meeting, whether it's next year or if it's I don't know how long the task would take. I would assume 1 year would be sufficient, as to a recommendation as to whether the water commissioners should continue as the selectmen or some other model. So I suggest, I'll throw that out either for discussion now, if you have initial reactions, or at our next meeting we can talk about that.
Well, to the first matter that you raised, namely expertise, Article NN does specifically authorize the selectmen to hire a superintendent, namely a person with the appropriate licenses and knowledge and experience to operate the water supply system. And that is the usual mode of governance in the 41 cities and towns that Aaron and I have looked at. There's typically, they call them different things: superintendents, supervisors, department heads, but it all comes down to there's basically a person that is hired that has the expertise to run the system, and the selectmen that's the kind of hiring they do all the time. So it's not that they have to independently know how to put chemicals in the water treatment plant. They have to know how to identify and get somebody that could do that.
And I agree with you entirely on that.
On the second part of your comment, Victor, I haven't really given it any thought. I would think that because it is so prevalent that elected water commissioners, separate for elected selectmen, seem to be involved in the governance, that in my mind, I wouldn't identify that as a priority, but it's certainly something that can be considered in the future.
We certainly have sewer commissioners.
Mm-hmm.
We do.
And I would say too, I think that, that just as it's been spoken to about, well, we're gonna see how the first year goes and reevaluate, I mean, I think that, like you said, we've received correspondence from people with some questions about this topic. They've come to some meetings that we've had, so I think what you mentioned, I think it's just as appropriate to reevaluate it in a year, just as we are everything with this. And, I would say that those commissioners, whoever they are, I would think really provide a policy oversight. I don't think you put that all in the hands of a supervisor who's maybe interfacing on, maintenance issues or whatnot with the O&M vendor, but I think there's the need for collaboration on the policy kind of oversight that, because we know we've met some citizens that have been part of this process that are been in the utility industry for a long time, much like we probably do with sewer commissioners, and I think they can add a lot of value to the process.
I have a question
Sure.
on that topic. So you laid out a very reasonable assertion of perhaps we put forth this question to a study. What, along this similar scope and vein, what else is within our purview to recommend to, let's say for just the sake of discussion, that this group found that we didn't think that this was a path. That's a bad example because I don't think that's necessarily what I'm trying to say, but is there is there other things that this committee would be able to make as a recommendation that then is put forth to town meeting for consideration, in addition to your reasonable assumption of, or reasonable suggestion of suggesting the water commissioners?
Well, I guess I'm not sure what specifically you might have in mind, but.
Well, I don't
my-
have anything specific in
my-
mind, I'm just trying to understand the scope of what our purview is.
My understanding is that just like any of the other articles, we can make a recommendation as long as it's within the scope of the article as to no action or the article itself, or anything that modifies, you can make an amendment on town meeting floor, for example. We can make that amendment, as it were, in our initial we, meaning the advisory committee, in our initial recommended motion.
Okay.
So I think we do have some room, although there may be some things that just wouldn't work.
And I'm not looking for the outlandish, I'm looking to understand where, where our thought process should focus.
Bob, just thinking back to your comment about, I appreciate how prevalent it is, but for someone who's thinking in their head that they'd like to see a different solution, what is the mechanism, if the article passed as written, what is the mechanism for changing a commissioner from the selectmen to elected? Do we have any idea?
I think there'd probably need to be another warrant article
You would need a future town meeting vote.
that would vote to have a board of elected water commissioners.
So that article would eliminate, I mean, I guess, because we'd have the same timing problem. In other words, that article would state that the commissioners are the selectmen until an elected official, until such election as, in other words, it would bifurcate the commissioner from the selectman role, and then you would elect commissioners. That would be the idea.
Correct. Under the statute, if in the future you go to an elected commission, the statute says that the selectmen serve until such election anyway. So the selectmen are gonna be in that role.
Right, so if we
until the
recommended no
ultimate
action,
election.
they still would become commissioners.
Well, just to be cautious, and I think it's important that within the scope of this warrant article, we're saying we're gonna put the Board of Selectmen first. And I think it is important for the town to be clear as to who they want to run this water company. But if it's switched in the future to, we wanna go from the selectmen to an elected board, the selectmen would continue in that role until that election was held. There'd be a transition period. But I still think it's important to set the selectmen up initially so that we're clear who's in control of this enterprise fund and who sets rates and everything else. And then in the future, you can revisit that, and you can have a transition, but I think it's important to start with that baseline.
Do you see as the idea of having a committee under an N, I guess, study the question, report back to a future town meeting is within the scope of the article?
I don't know, the article doesn't mention anything about a committee. It's something I'd have to run by the moderator. Obviously, Mike Puzo would have some say in that. It's his final call. So I think we'd really have to think about whether that's within the scope of that article.
I seem to remember doing that in some article in the past, although I'm blanking on which one it was.
The change in the number of selectmen?
Oh, the change in the number of selectmen. Yeah, we brought and certainly Mike Puzo supported that one.
Did you replace the warrant article instead with a referral to a committee? Because that's something that happens often. That's different than saying we recommend that the selectmen be appointed, but then in addition, we're gonna do a second step and appoint a committee. Those are two different. So I just have to talk to
It'd
Mike
be
about
interesting
that.
to get feedback as to whether that's within the scope of the article.
Can I ask a second question too?
Sure.
Why are sewer commissioners elected and water I mean, it sounds like,
Sewer commission was by a special act.
oh, that's the.
So there was a special act back in, I don't remember the years, the 60s maybe? 40s, that set up the sewer commission as an elected board. What's interesting, that act is similar also because it said that the selectmen could have acted and would act until the sewer commission was elected, but they've been elected under that special act for years.
Got it, okay, thank you.
Mr. Johnston, did you?
Karen Johnson, Board of Selectmen. I guess a couple of things. One, I would welcome kind of ongoing evaluation if the town were to purchase this and begin to operate it. I think there are going to be a lot of eyes on this, right? And I'm concerned about sort of a year timeline. I think there's going to be a transition process to, acquire and then run. And so I'm worried about creating kind of an artificial boundary when we may or may not have sufficient information to really evaluate the question. And the other thing I guess I get worried about is when you have kind of multiple committees at play. And so the structure that we've established does two things. One, it institutionalizes citizen input with the Citizens Advisory Board. And then the second thing it does is it's meant to bring to the fore a transition team to help with this process. And I think, I think Josh Krumholtz has spoken to this. I think I've spoken to this. I think as we transition, I think we will be getting feedback from that group as to how this process evolves. So I'm worried about, I guess, just establishing another committee and trying to really roll out this organizational structure. I'm in no way, I think we need to evaluate this in a multiple of ways, but I'm worried about, I guess, establishing another committee in this structure, and I'm also concerned about that kind of tight timeline, given the nature of the transaction we have before us.
Thank you.
I'd agree with that about the timeline, because if we think about if the town meeting votes to acquire the water company, we're going to have that period of some months, maybe 4 to 6 months of transition of good faith operation by Aquarian. And I would think we'd want the selectmen to have a year or more of experience before somebody could really step back and kind of think about, is this where we want to be or not?
Mm-hmm. Well, that may be, I did suggest 1 or 2 years, so perhaps, but that's it's a valid point.
Chairman Richard Pedoni, 12 Newtown Drive, Council for Aquarian. So on the governance issue, there's a piece that has not been touched upon, and that is you've discussed the elected officials in Hingham serving as commissioners, and the discussion so far has spoken as if it was only commissioners of a system in one town.
I have on my agenda discussions about impacts on Hull and Cohasset, so if...
So it's not just impacts on Hull, this is a fundamental legal question. I don't believe the framework that set up Hingham selectmen or selectmen to serve as commissioners for a single town, as if you read the statutes, that's what it looks like, was actually intended to apply to the 1879 charter. And Hingham selectmen elected in Hingham, stepping in and running a system outside of Hingham. So there's case law, if Hingham decided to run an ambulance company or an ice cream stand in another town, we'd be outside of our bounds, and Hingham selectmen wouldn't have immunity, et cetera, protections doing that. So what you have to rely on for the authority of Hingham selectmen or anyone elected just in Hingham to run a system in Hull is the charter. And you have to say, does the charter say Hingham selectmen can run it? Do all of the subsequent statutory protections that govern how special town officials such as yourselves, special employees get protected, et cetera, everything that governs traditional town governance, the Home Rule Charter presumes you're running a system within the bounds of your town. And so what the Hingham is about to embark on, passes this, is unprecedented in running material assets, a third of the system, in a different town. And I don't believe that the statutory framework, how decisions get made, how insurance would be purchased, how governance decisions would be made, and all those protections have been fully analyzed. I certainly haven't heard them being discussed. And I think, again, this is an issue that town council or council retained for the purpose could actually dig into the authority and could give an opinion. We've looked at the charter and we think it does, implicitly or otherwise, cover you. And then here are the pitfalls. For example, will the officials be protected by immunity? So I think that deep dive into Hingham officials and employees, volunteers, running a business, serving a vital resource in another town needs to be analyzed.
So why is this situation different from situations where, as I understand, our sewer service serves some people in Cohasset, and there are mean, other situations where, certainly not with this large percentage of the service area, but there are other situations we've heard where one town serves retail in other communities. So why is that not?
Sure, and that's an important question. So every instance that I've been able to identify where service is provided in another town, except on wholesale provision of water, it's a de minimis compared to the total supply. It's a few hundred at
Right,
most.
but still, the legal issue should be the same, shouldn't it?
If they've ever been challenged, you're doing it on a scale that is unprecedented by a factor of 100 or more, from what I've been able to analyze. And it's material, and it's substantial. It's not a small scale. And I can't find authority for it. And I don't know if town council has, but I say this is unprecedented. And then when I think about the immunity statutes, et cetera, and it's certainly not provided for in the home rule statute that we can govern what occurs in Hull, I say this needs to be looked at with great detail, because it truly could be an authority showstopper post-purchase.
So if the officials here were subject to liability, and as you're suggesting, perhaps couldn't operate a business outside the town boundaries, that would apply to all these other situations, even though you say they're de minimis. That would mean they all are unauthorized as well, and that those officials are also not protected.
And I'm not standing here saying I have a definitive answer that those are illegal. I'm just saying this is unprecedented. I have not been able to locate the authority that says anything on this scale is authorized. And then when I step back from it and I say, well, when do you have multiple operations in multiple towns? How has that occurred on a larger scale in Massachusetts? It's always in a district. And you know, that's an option open here, is the assets would be deposited into a district, and the authority would be obtained for the district to have commissioners from both towns and then run the assets. And that's perfectly consistent with the authority of Hingham to purchase, because it's a natural question. You get this charter that says Hingham can purchase. Can it run? I'd say, sure, you've got the authority to purchase, but nobody actually ever addressed how Hingham would run assets in the other towns. And so your question is good. People do it in a few other locations, or many locations where it's these de minimis. But if you actually ask yourself, where is the authority for them to do it? What legislature protections govern them? What common law protections govern them? I keep bumping into things that say you've got more problems and potential risk doing things outside of your boundary than you do protection. And I'm open to Mr. Coughlin saying, Mr. Pedoni, you have it wrong, go look at this statute. But I think it's something the town should address. And in our public records request, we asked for opinions on the finance and the governance. We got the summary opinion I discussed before on finance. We did not find any legal opinion that looks like the town has addressed this issue, and we believe that it should be addressed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just briefly, and I respect Mr. Pedoni, but I also think that, you know, the counsel for Aquarian should not be giving legal advice to the town of Hingham, and I think the town of Hingham's attorneys have looked at this closely. We've issued legal opinions to town officials. We are comfortable with this. I think you have to look at the special act, which has language specifically in the special act that allows us to buy this service area A, which says that we can run this service area A by officers, servants, or agents as the town may direct. And that's under Section 18 of Chapter 139 of the Acts of 1879. So I caution and I appreciate wanting to raise red flags, but I also think at the same time, I think the town's attorneys have looked at this closely, and we've given our legal opinions, and we're comfortable that we can move forward.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Rowe.
Polly Rowe, 9 Rockview Road. Longtime Hingham resident, but now I live in Hull. I have a question, and I ask this respectfully and seriously. I remember when I first read quite some time ago in the Hull Times has excellent coverage of the Hingham takeover process, and I said, wow, isn't that a conflict of interest to have the Hingham Selectmen also serve as the water commissioners? I'm speaking as a layperson. Well, I'm wondering, I have a Patriot Ledger article from April 24th, 2013, and the title of the article is Hingham Voters OK $3.75 million land purchase for sewer plant. And the third paragraph, excuse me, to lead to my question, says, quote, "This article, the warrant article, is simply about commercial economic development," said Selectman Bruce Rebuffo, who helped negotiate the land deal. So my question has been and still is, what is to stop or prevent a select person, male or female, who may be, for example, negotiating a land deal in South Hingham or, something in Hingham, from influencing the decisions that will be made as water commissioners, and particularly because there is no formal legal protective agreement, contractual agreement between the towns? What is to stop any one of the selectmen from, interests of different, the selectmen and the commissioners overlapping and intertwining and then affecting the other towns served, as well as Hingham residents, and we have no say-so in that. Do you understand my question?
You mean, would the selectmen be incentivized to extend the system perhaps to serve an area that's currently not served by adequate water, which, as if they were elected water commissioners or if they were the private entity, they might not do otherwise?
Yes, exactly. Or to say, gee, we should prioritize work here when, this area, whether it's in Hingham Hall or Cohasset, has been waiting for an awfully long time, but they want to push this forward because it might help economic development. Yes, to me as a layperson, that's a possibility.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Great. Further comments on what we've heard? Okay.
Well, I always hate hypothetical questions because you never get enough information in them to give a really good answer. But I think we have a whole process of boards and oversight in Hingham. We have a multi-person board of selectmen. I think there are a lot of checks and balances that are baked into the way we do public business in Hingham. Things are done in the open, and I would find it hard to conceive of a hypothetical situation where I would have a real concern. Guess I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Ms. Power.
Thank you for saying that, Bob. On behalf of current, past, and future members of the Board of Selectmen, I would also just add that we also have to be conscious that right now, within the existing service area A, we are at about 90% of the withdrawal limits as defined by the Department of Environmental Protection. And, all communities have a certain number of gallons of water that can be drawn. I think for us it's a little bit over 3 million gallons a day. It's a little bit less in the winter, a little bit more in the summer. But, there are strict penalties if you exceed that. So, right now the question of expanding water service, I think we have to remember that the DEP, which will continue to play a regulatory role with respect to the water supply, would fall into place. So I think given our situation right now, that's a very hypothetical situation.
Thank you. All right, let's turn to Hull and Cohasset. We do have a large number of ratepayers outside Hingham. Does that pose problems in people's view? The legislature always envisioned that Hingham would have the opportunity to take over the system, at least as I read the statute and the subsequent amendments. And the legislature understood that the system included services outside of town. I guess, are there concerns about unfair rates? Would there be discriminatory rates? Is the issue that outside Hingham residents would not have a say in rates, even if they were not discriminatory? Would that be more than what the situation is now? DPU, we've heard, is hard to access, but Hull is represented there. Cohasset, I guess, could be represented there. Citizens Advisory Board has been suggested as a way to hear the voice of both Hingham and non-Hingham residents, and the proposal that we've heard is 40% of the board would be Hull and Cohasset residents, 2 of the 5 members, if I did the math right, yeah. You know, so is there appropriate concern that those other communities could get shortchanged on capital improvements? You know, how does that all play out? Those ratepayers also will benefit from any savings. I mean, if your analysis is right, Dave, that, well, again, it depends on all the assumptions that one buys into. But if your versions would show a savings, those savings would redound to all the ratepayers, not just those in Hingham. I think there are some protections from the enterprise fund set up because the money can't be diverted to other Hingham uses or anyone else's uses. There have been questions about whether there should be an intermunicipal agreement, and I'm just throwing these all out for discussion. What exactly would the intermunicipal agreement say? I mean, what is the idea of what folks are trying to get that agreement to do? Sort of hammer down a pilot? I suppose that would be a subject for a intermunicipal agreement. If the water operation were going to say, yeah, we'll pay, you know, whatever in lieu of taxes to Hull, to Cohasset. You know, there, I guess, are reportedly, I think we heard at one of our earlier meetings, existing agreements, if you will, intermunicipal, intercompany with the towns now for emergency water. We heard information from the chair of our sewer commissioners, that this has not been an issue, that he does have customers that he serves in Cohasset, and that it's not been a problem. You know, again, not the same number of customers, but you know, so I'll throw those out for any reaction one way or the other.
I'm struck by, and I'm not sure which one of the attorneys that spoke to this, was that we don't have a choice, in the sense that if Hingham would like to buy its water company, it's buying service area A. So for me, it got to a point of, okay, well, if that's the case, then what do we do to ensure and make sure that the voices of Cohasset and Hull service receivers, for lack of a better phrase, are being heard? And I felt that the Citizens Advisory Board gave a mechanism for that. I mean, arguably, you could say it's not enough of a mechanism, but it is a mechanism in light of the fact that we can't pick and choose what part of service area A we're to acquire. Libby and I looked at some of the IMAs and what they look like and how they're structured. And to me, it looked that those agreements were more similar to the way that we work in our emergency, where you have Norwell helping out Hingham and so forth, so that the services are all being shared among multiple towns. And I don't think that the analogy doesn't hold. Now, that doesn't mean that we couldn't have come up with an MOU that kind of explained more about how we were going to work together. You know, and this is perhaps a bit of a tangent off of what you were talking about, but I don't know if that fits into what we can talk about in the governance article, if that's something we want to address there. And perhaps that's semantics, but to me, it doesn't feel like an IMA is the appropriate vehicle for that, but perhaps some sort of stated agreement beyond what we've stated in our governance thus far would be appropriate. So that's my initial reaction to your statements.
I think I sent you that sort of guideline, but that's one thing I have to go back and look at a little bit deeper, so I can't necessarily say I came to the same conclusion that you did, because I haven't gotten through the whole thing yet. But, you know, the idea that, that, I mean, we've all, I would think, have heard from different people, oh yeah, I've heard, you know, people have said there's an MOU and this and that. It just seems like of a purchase of this magnitude, if there is one, okay, that's fine if it doesn't, if it's not required to be part of a warrant article. But if something's out there and it's drafted and it exists, it should be discussed in the context of this, given the magnitude of the purchase. So the fact that it sounds like there may be something, but yet we haven't seen anything, and I think is troubling.
I'm sorry, so you're suggesting that you've heard that there is a draft or an existing MOU out?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of different people in Hull saying, oh yeah, I heard there's an MOU. I mean, I'm going back to like 6-8 months ago. So it sounded like people sound like they, oh yeah, there's an MOU. Well, I don't know if there is or there isn't, but if there, I think there should be, and it's been some discussion that there may be or will be an MOU, but then we should see what it looks like, because that's part of this whole discussion, to be spending and committing this much money to this kind of an endeavor, in my opinion. And I would hope, I guess finally on the Citizens Advisory Board, I mean, I would hope that they have some, I guess for lack of a better phrase, that their voices will be heard, because we've been, I mean, I can say personally in situations where I've asked questions and gotten no answers. And I mean in open meetings where there's meant to be a dialogue, you ask a question like we're doing tonight and you get an answer. And I've been in situations where I've asked the question and gotten no answer. And that is really concerning to me as we go down the road with this purchase, that people won't have that ability to have it be a two-way discussion. So I hope that the Citizen Advisory Board is that their voices get heard and that they're not just considered a formality in this process.
Okay, Bob?
Yeah, let me see if I can address the points in the order that I remember you raised the questions. I think the first thing was, you know, could there be discriminatory rates based on geography? And I think the answer to that is probably a clear no, just not possible. The next could there be discrimination somehow with respect to capital expenditures? Well, I think there are always going to be geographical variances based on where the need is. And I think I would divide my thinking on that into two parts. I think if anyone in any community has a water type emergency that needs to be addressed, I think that's clearly going to be addressed as a matter of first priority. If a hurricane hits Hull and Hull has its water system more damaged than Hingham's water system, I'm sure that Hull is going to get the priority attention that it needs. I think otherwise, in terms of capital expenditure, from what I've heard, it sounds to me like the town's approach is, if anything, to accelerate capital expenditure and to thereby ultimately reduce costs and increase the reliability of the overall system. So I think basically the town is buying an enterprise, buying a business, and it's in the interest of the town and everybody within the enterprise to minimize costs. And that's not going to happen if people think somehow there's going to be discrimination. On intermunicipal agreements, my research on them is typically where you know, you've got Cohasset, you've got a fire engine and we need a fire engine, and we're going to make an agreement about that. Or we need emergency power and we're going to make an agreement about that. Or we're going to have emergency water and we'll make an agreement about that. But we're buying a coherent water supply system that all of which would be owned by the town of Hingham. It is not where Hull is sharing or Cohasset is sharing water supply assets that they have, that they own and somehow are contributing to this water supply system. I mean, it's a privilege and a burden, I suppose, for the town of Hingham to be the operator of the water supply system. It's got upsides and downsides, but I don't know what the intermunicipal agreement would say. And on Libby's point, I saw Karen, I mean, this is probably an easy one. Is there a memo of understanding? I see you're shaking your head no.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think Karen Johnson, Board of Selectmen, no, there is no memorandum of understanding. There have been conversations. I've had conversations with both Hull and Cohasset around things like emergency water. We've had conversations with Hull and Cohasset around just the point that you raised, that we are taking a systemic view. We have to take a systemic view. That's what we have, is a water system that encompasses this geographic region. So no, there is nothing written down. To your point, though, Libby, I think that I view this as a task for the transition team to think through what might be appropriate content for an agreement between Hull and Cohasset, Hingham and Hull and Hingham and Cohasset. Emergency water may be one of those things. There are some communities, when we analyze the 41 towns, they provide emergency water. They just provide emergency water, and they don't meter it. So there is no IMA or memorandum of understanding on those topics. Other towns take a more formalistic view of some of those interrelationships with their neighboring communities. So, my view on this is I view that piece of the transaction as being a transition team element, because I think, to me, it's a technical operational element. What are the ways that the water system is going to interact with the municipalities versus the water system and its customers?
But wouldn't you also view that as a liability mitigation document? I mean, people have said, oh, well, the day that, if town meeting votes for this, the day that town meeting votes for it, then within some reasonable time frame, like that's when the price is determined. And then so the minute we go out and issue the short-term debt, and ultimately, it won't be a year till we do the long-term debt, and we quote unquote own the water company, we correspondingly own any potential liabilities there. So don't you see that something that should be addressed with the 6 years that the town has spent researching this, that we should know and have some idea of what that should be now when we purchase it, from the day that we assume all those liabilities, rather than saying, well, we'll wait till down the road.
I guess I see it as a fundamentally different question. I mean, we are buying the water system with its assets and liabilities. That's what we're purchasing. The assets and liabilities would be supported by all of the ratepayers, as Bob said. So that's what we own, that's what we're buying. And I thought you were asking then, what would be the specific relationship between the water system and Hull and the water system and Cohasset?
Right, and that's what I'm saying, is the minute we buy it, we now have a responsibility to service area A.
Right.
So to the extent that some of these issues and different things arise from the minute that we own it, we have to be able to understand what each town's respective either roles or responsibilities are. And if that's something that's not done later until the transition time, then there's a period of time where there's no kind of meeting of the minds and understanding on.
I think we do understand what our role is. We are the water system operator. So just like Attleboro, for instance, who supplies water to customers in Norton and owns the pipes that run from Attleboro to Norton, they are responsible for those pipes, and they're responsible for the delivery of water. We are responsible for all the pipes in service area A and all of the customers in service area A.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's just a miscommunication, because that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about not what our responsibility is as owners of service area, and our understanding, memo of understanding with the other communities in service area A, as far as if some of those circumstances or different situations would arise during that period once we've assumed the assets and liabilities of the water company.
You mean in a transition period, or once we?
I never brought up transition period. That's what Karen did.
But I guess I'm a little confused, because I thought initially you were talking about some sort of agreement, and I was going to ask you more specifically with the other communities, but then I thought your point I thought was, you were saying, we don't know what liabilities there may be that the company has currently, and since we're inheriting those.
No,
we
no,
should
no, I'm
know
not
that.
talking about like liabilities with a capital L. I'm talking about,
Risks.
I'm talking about risks, yeah. I'm talking about the fact that if we assume ownership on day one and we're gonna wait for this, transition period of 6 months to determine what this MOU should look like, during that time, thank you, Aaron, is that we have these risks during that time of how we're going to handle situations that may arise with these other communities in service area A. That's what I'm saying.
Like situations like what, for
Well,
example?
what were some of the things you brought up, Bob, about, were you talking about like water supply or, I mean,
No,
I'm not a utility I'm not a utility expert. You're saying don't bring me into this?
I think the only risk I talked about was the hurricane.
Yeah. I think, I'm not a
know,
utility expert, so I can't answer
And
that question, so.
I think it's,
So I think if a water main were to break the day after we buy it, and the water main breaks in Hull, we have to do exactly what Aquarian does today.
Yeah,
They
that's-
have to go to, that's not, well,
That's
okay.
a normal course of business.
Right.
I'm talking about things that address, like any business arrangement does, when there are things that are outside of the normal course of business. So I'm not talking like a water main breaks and who's gonna
I
fix
mean,
it.
if somebody
and-
comes in
yeah.
and sabotages the,
Well, I'm not talking that nefarious, but,
Well, I guess the question becomes, what is within the water system and the kind of the purview of the water system, and what I thought you were asking, which is, and how should we document the water system's relationship with the adjacent municipalities in which we have customers? And so that latter piece I view as a technical transition piece that would highlight things like the provision of emergency water to Hull fire hydrants. That to me, in my research of IMAs and memos of understanding between towns, that's one of the topics that's covered. But otherwise, the operation of the business itself would need to provide service, would need, as Bob said, if there's a hurricane the day after we buy it, we would need to respond as the water operator would respond. So I guess I'm just, and maybe we can talk offline,
Yeah,
because I know you've asked the question a couple times, and and you seem to imply you weren't getting an answer, and I don't know where you're not getting an answer from me. I'm happy to talk to you offline about it, because I am trying to answer the question, and I guess my research suggests that a memorandum of understanding would certainly be something I think we should work on with Hull and Cohasset with respect to specific technical issues that would involve the relationship of the water system to the municipalities.
yeah, and that's really what I was getting at, not the normal course of business if a main breaks or
so,
whatnot.
so you're suggesting, so from your research, there are other communities with similar service to a neighbor, which do have some sort of municipal agreements?
The ones where I've seen the IMA in place, and Bob, or Aaron, you may have found this, is mostly with respect to bulk water purchases, so consecutive systems where, it'd be our responsibility to bring the water to the line, and then
To the wholesale
to the
situation.
wholesale situation, yeah. I have not seen IMAs with respect to customers on bordering towns. Attleboro may be different because there are different pockets of population that they service, and that encompasses North Attleboro, Mansfield, and like I think I said before, they have an emergency water agreement with Pawtucket, Rhode Island. That is a documented agreement. But yeah, it's the IMA kind of more formalistic contractual relationships among communities I've seen more in the case of bulk water sales.
Richard, can I ask one more? Karen, can I ask one last thing? Have you received any inbound requests from either Cohasset or Hull to get an IMA?
No. We've, Dave, the process has definitely evolved, right? So we started out in one place, and part of it was, we thought maybe, to your point, Aaron, wow, maybe we can splinter this thing up, and we'll buy our piece, and they can buy their piece, and so I think as we understood what our obligations and opportunities were under the statute, I think our thinking evolved. Because I was, to be honest with you, all sort of gung-ho in the beginning with the governance group with Charlie Cristello and Josh saying, look I'm a lawyer. We need to write this stuff down. And in the end, and I think it was Josh who was like, okay, but these are the customers of the water system. And Hull is a customer of the water system, but then you have to look at, well, what's the direct interrelationship between the water system and the municipality? And that's where I think that becomes, to me, a transition element by people who are expert in this area.
But you don't get a sense, as you stand here today, that there's any concern on Cohasset or Hull's part about the absence of a IMA
Not
this
at
point?
all. And, I think Tom may have spoken to this in the past. We work cooperatively with both Hull and Cohasset on a number of things. Our emergency response. Hull provides sewer treatment. We don't have an IMA for that. Yes, we do. Yeah, there is an IMA for that. But we work cooperatively with them. I think that, to be honest, the reaction is they're excited about this opportunity because I think they see it as restoring or gaining local control over, an essential part of our operation.
Thanks.
And I would say ultimately it's the party that's assuming the debt that's the one that's going to be looking for the IMA. So or MOU. I mean, I'm not saying it has to be if the IMA isn't appropriate, but I'm saying it's the party that assumes the liability is the one who wants to protect themselves against those risks. The other side isn't going to care. So I don't think those other towns would.
So when you were just speaking about your research on IMAs, were you including MOUs too, or is that different? Would you give a different answer on that?
Yeah, to be honest, Victor, when I spoke with these communities, they have so many of these relationships, and many of them are not written down at all. And so I think the more formal arrangements are with respect to the sale of bulk water. And we called each and every one of those 41 towns, Michelle and I, mostly Michelle, to talk about their water operation, the use of personnel, the use of outside contractors. In many cases, there's a combination on the operations side. Some of them will have like MWRA water, but they have all municipal employees that run the distribution and the billing. And, so the front face of the water system is the town, and the water treatment's provided by MWRA. Sometimes there's a for-profit operator of a particular pump station or treatment plant, but the rest of the town is, the town runs the rest of the operation. So while there is consistency in some things, there's also, I think, historic relationships among neighboring communities that have grown up around the provision of water that, maybe under different circumstances would look different, but it's much less formal, I think, than you would think.
And I would just add, Victor, too, that I think we have to be mindful of these 41 comparable communities because, as we've been told in these meetings, there isn't another water system like Service Area A that's really a comparable with almost 40% of the assets outside the town. So I just want to be careful that we don't rely so much on these comparables that aren't entirely comparable. So I just want us to be aware of that.
And Victor, I know I've said this before, but whether you call it an IMA or MOU, those agreements, if there is one in the future, the Board of Selectmen under the law have the authority to do that, does not require a town meeting vote, which is why the warrant articles don't deal with that directly.
Okay. Ms. Rowe.
Excuse me, getting over the bug. Holly Rowe, 9 Rockview Road, Hull. I can't tell you how nervous I am sitting here listening to officials say once again that there will be no contractual agreement in writing before this goes to town meeting. I have gone to every possible, the meetings in Hingham, the WCASC, I think I got those letters right. I've asked the questions about this. I have written to this board a very extensive letter with attachments asking you please to vote against these warrant articles until such time as we get some sort of a contractual written agreement that the customers have been made aware of in advance, that everyone is in consent with, and so forth. I have a number of things to say, and I will try to be concise because of the hour. I'm glad it was brought up that Hingham and Hull do, in fact, have a very extensive written IMA between the towns. And I asked to get that myself because I'm a very, very, very concerned citizen. I know where I stand with Aquarian water if something should happen. And now, under proposed Hingham Town ownership, if something should happen that you weren't prepared for example, but it's going to affect all of us, I have no guarantee that I won't be held responsible for that. When I, as a homeowner, as a credit card owner, any of the responsibilities and obligations I have in my life, I know before I get into that relationship, the terms and the conditions, they're in writing. And I want to know those because I want to know not only what am I liable for, but I want to make sure what I'm not liable for. And that has to be in writing for everybody's protection. As to the working cooperatively amongst the towns, I'll say this in the nicest way possible. As I wrote in my letter, I almost jumped out of my skin when I was watching the March 2018 Hingham Board of Selectmen's meeting, and I heard then former Hingham Selectman Bruce Rebuffo say, well, to date, we have the cooperation of all the town's officials. Hello? Hull town officials have not ever been formally told about this. I had a group at my home after going to an Aquarian forum. We composed a letter to send to the Hull Selectmen seeking answers, seeking a public meeting, seeking information. That's how many people in Hull are concerned about this because they don't know where they're going to stand. We're going to be paying, $60 million over 30 years. We're paying for Hingham's exclusive ownership in this, but we'll get no assets, partial assets in this. I was shocked and incensed to find out that in a closed-door executive session, Hull officials sanctioned the town council to write a letter in support of Hingham, for which the Hingham selectmen thanked them, pleading to the Mass Supreme Court on behalf of Hingham's protracted legal proceedings that we are now mandated to pay for, that we had no say-so in that. The Hull citizens have not been made aware of this and not been involved in anything. This is news to us. We feel like we've had, how do they say, taxation without representation. I have found out, unfortunately, we again in Hull, it's been going on for about the last 5 years, again are going to be having a special town meeting to try to get a turf field. When I went, along with many other Hull residents, on November 1st, 2018, to the town's multiple different boards presentation, the recreational rehabilitation plan. This was November 1st, that was what, 6-7 months ago? Our town election isn't until May 2019. What is the last page on the document that was given to the public? First item, execute an MOU between the school committee and the Board of Selectmen on cost sharing. I had asked the question, as a homeowner in the town, what happens if the school committee were not going to be able to raise the money each year to which they have committed? How do we deal with that? And they said there will be an MOU. As a responsible citizen, I don't understand why there is an intermunicipal agreement regarding sewer, regarding the town of Hingham's light plan in the town of Hingham, regarding a proposed turf field, and the school department and the Hull Board of Selectmen. I don't understand why on all those matters there is a written formal agreement to address things, but on something like a multi-million-dollar purchase of a water company, the risks and the uncertainties which do exist in the future that we don't know about, there's no written agreement. I don't understand it. And more importantly, I don't want to be held responsible for things that come down the road that were not of my making. Whenever the water company operator gets chosen. Again, something that Hull does not have any say-so in. The literature which I sent you on that company having been sued, whether it's negligence, fraud, whatever it is, the lead poisoning, those are very serious things that affect, yeah, we're talking about money. They affect money, but they also affect health. We have no say-so in that. And to enter into this without having a written agreement that's going to protect customers, to me, is dangerous. And I should feel rightly so afraid. Bear with me if I just refer. The governance model, in all the meetings that I've attended, I've gone to every possible Aquarian forum, which has been public in both towns. I've gone to all the Water Acquisition Committee meetings. I've watched the BOS meetings in Hingham. I have heard it said a number of times that people have witnessed former Hingham Selectman Bruce Rebuffo saying that many Hingham residents are adamantly against paying for Hingham's capital improvements and infrastructure repairs. I don't know what the procedure is for how the town ownership, how you plan to make those decisions. For example, my understanding at this moment is maybe at annual Hingham Town Meeting, again, Hull people have no vote in any of this, you will say, you know, we want to spend X numbers of dollars to do, you know, whatever the repairs. Well, what happens if the Hingham voters feel that it's more important to vote on whatever they're doing in Hingham and we'll get to Hull next year? We don't have any say-so in that. It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem equitable. The governance model, it had originally been one thing in 2012 because our town manager had advocated on behalf of certain things. It has changed to what it is now. As I remember, Attorney Josh Krumholtz, if I'm saying his name correctly, had even brought up during one of the meetings. He said, well, what's to say someday Hull may want to, I don't know, buy our own part of the water company or something like that. I'm like, wow, I don't foresee that. But my point is, we don't know that it's not going to change again in the future. And we have no guarantees that are protecting us as ratepayers, whether we're here in Hingham or, more importantly, in a different town. And I don't know as I'm standing here, and that's what makes me so nervous. I know where I stand with Aquarian. I know where I stand with things that lay out in advance, in writing, all the terms and the conditions, and the legal recourse for those. I don't know where I stand should something happen. And things do happen. If you pay attention to water around the country, things are happening, and they're serious. We don't know where we stand. And I think that the last thing that I would like to say is I would like to read the conclusion to my letter to you. Please. It is established business practice to formalize contractual agreements in writing, both to avoid prospective disputes for all parties involved and to properly enhance effective enforcement. In certain legal contexts, as some of us know, it is a mandatory requirement that any agreement memorialized in writing be accompanied by witness signatures. All you need to do is Google the risk of not having a written contract to know that it is dangerously risky to conduct business in any context without having a signed, written contract of which all parties involved are aware and in full consent. I respectfully ask that you not recommend the water acquisition warrant articles until such a written contract has been properly executed, publicly shared with all 3 towns' water customers, and public discussion has taken place. Thank you for your consideration.
So, if I can ask, so what do you envision going into a contract of this sort? What are the terms or the types of topics you would have addressed?
Well, first of all, respectfully, I'm not an attorney. I'm a water customer. But secondly, the things that I'm using this Hingham Hull Sewer IMA as an example, but I know that there's a big difference between sewer and water. All I can think of at this moment is anything that should be specified, whether it's regarding the liabilities, regarding the unforeseen risks, the uncertainties, things that will protect the ratepayers, the consumers, against unforeseen accidents that are not of their making, protect them from not being held liable for things that the new ownership is not yet aware of, to protect them, for example, as happened in Situate when they suddenly had undrinkable water and suddenly raised their rates 20%. And I do remember, I have the article, but it's all the details aren't in my mind. I remember reading for new home buyers, when you have to connect to the service, the rate jumped from something like $4,000 or $5,000 to $14,000. I don't have any protection over those types of things as I stand before you today. I think of my credit cards. I think of my mortgage company. I think of my homeowner's insurance. If they were to suddenly tell me, oh, by the way, tomorrow, you know what, we're gonna like raise your rate 25% because somebody down the street from you, charged something on your credit card or whatever, I'd be rightly upset. So when I think of the basic business, like you do with a credit card, like you do with owning a home, to protect from unforeseen and risks and liabilities for which I shouldn't be held, not me personally, but as a customer, held responsible. I don't see any legal protections at this point. And
of course, the Hingham ratepayers don't have that either.
well, I am speaking as a Hull resident, but I also, as I said in the opening of my letter, for all ratepayers, for Hingham, Hull, and Cohasset, absolutely. This is too big monetarily, but also when I was starting to get sick this morning when I was reading some of the articles on the, if I'm saying it correctly, the Veolia company and the lead poisoning, the things that can go on with water when you have people who don't have a solid, long-term proven track record of experience. I don't want to suddenly find myself, finances is one thing. I'd rather pay more money and know I can sleep at night because I trust, the confidence has been instilled in me by the experts running the company. I'm not getting that sense from what I've been hearing in all these meetings. I'm getting the sense of we'll kind of figure it out as we go along and try this one and try that one. This is water. It's not, and I say this respectfully, it's not like, oh, we're going to have Chinese food or we're going to have Italian food for dinner tonight. This is really, really serious. The lead poisoning across the country. We need, when I have worked with professionals in the past, I say to people, I'm intelligent and I can understand a lot of the things that they're saying, but I don't need to understand everything. But what I do need to do is to be able to have complete trust and confidence that I know that person knows their business and they're going to be responsible so I can sleep at night.
Okay.
And I don't feel that way right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mayo.
Tom Mayo, Town Administrator. I just wanted to touch on a couple of quick points, and I'll be brief. One is that, just so everyone understands, there's been an ownership change and for this water system, I think roughly 3 times in nearly the last decade. So that's one point. Second is to say that right now, the towns of Hingham, Hull, and Cohasset have no say on what kind of capital is expended. Third is those 3 towns currently have no MOU or IMA or any kind of an agreement with the water system operator now, Aquarian. Fourth, I have spoken as recently as today with Phil Lemnios, who's the town administrator in Hull, the town manager, who told me that he wanted to convey to you, if I had an opportunity to speak tonight, that his board of selectmen, the Hull Board of Selectmen, have been fully informed all along the way by me through Phil to them about these proceedings. So they feel fully informed. And fifth, the last point I'll make, excuse me, is that in discussions with both the Hingham Board of Selectmen as well as Phil Lemnios in Hull, we have agreed to have a joint Board of Selectmen meeting on March 21st. So that will be occurring. So there will be a public discussion in Hull on these issues. So that's coming in the offer.
Thank you. Mr. Walsh.
John Walsh, Vice President Operations for Aquarion. I just want to make a follow-up point to Mr. Mayo's comments. There is actually a contract between Aquarion and its customers, and those customers include the towns. It's our rules and regulations, and we can provide those to the committee. If you want to have an understanding of the types of things that are important to consider in a contract, that would be a great place for you to start.
If you can provide that, that would be. If you can
We'll
provide
send it
that,
along.
that would be useful.
Thank you.
Other thoughts, questions? All right, it's getting late. I'll just touch real briefly. We talked about earlier the questions of, you know, if the town indeed were to have lower rates, that it wouldn't necessarily all go to benefit of immediate rate reduction. It could be used for other capital. We've sort of touched on that point. You know, we would be, and I guess we've sort of talked about this a little bit too, would we be giving up the expertise of a large company if we used a contract operator, but that's balanced by the question of whether the contract operator has similar experience. On the regulation question, I think the sewer commissioner, who's also on the water supply committee and also seems to be on the Board of Health, suggested that regulations could be developed by the water supply committee, and that the Board of Health, you know, would have an input and collaboration on quality type issues. And then I'll just throw out the questions of intangibles. Is there a benefit of owning your own, controlling your own supply? It's been raised at some of the meetings by, I guess, proponents that once the threat of the purchase goes away, if the town were to choose not to go ahead, would the current sort of cooperative relationship with the company and the communities, would that go away? Would, even if that weren't to be the case, if there were to be a change of ownership with the company, would that relationship change? And we did talk about the risk, you know, we've sort of briefly talked about the risk of emerging contaminants or new regulations of anything, any sort that might impose additional costs. On the counter to that is, well, the ratepayers would be paying in any case, perhaps. We've also heard at some of our meetings, I think from the people from the Weir River Association were speaking, there was a thought that there might be more focus on local environmental concerns under local ownership. Don't know whether that's, you know, accurate or not. I think another thing to think about is, you know, is there a risk of town ownership versus private ownership from dealing with questions of drought or inadequate supply? I mean, how does that all play out in terms of, you know, how the town would react if it was, you know, now perhaps again, it's a question of whether ratepayers are going to be affected either way. On the other hand, does, I don't know, does the private entity have existing plans in place, existing relationships to try to deal with drought? And I don't know, I'm just throwing this out, I have no idea. Ms. Murphy.
I just want to speak to one of the points you had mentioned, the Ware River watershed people and the environment. And I didn't bring all of the specifics with me, but we can get them to the committee tomorrow. They were referenced in a letter to the editor from Selectman Healy, but with respect to water supply stewardship, since the inception of the Community Preservation Act, or the acceptance of it in Hingham, which has been less than 15 years, Hingham has spent almost $9 million in taxpayer dollars to preserve approximately, it's over 100 acres, I want to say it's about 130 acres, in land with a designated conservation value of water supply protection. In the last 30 years, there have been no land acquisitions by any of the water companies for water supply protection. So I do think that there's been a clear demonstration by the taxpayers already in the town, who are the same as the ratepayers, and also it's Hingham taxpayers paying to protect the water supply for all of Area A. So we can get you more specifics on that information. We have it charted, and we'll get that to you in the morning.
Okay, thank you. I think we talked about the enterprise fund, Bob. I don't know if you have anything more you want to say on that at this point.
I do have a draft comment and recommendation, preliminary.
Yeah, and I guess it sort of depends on the ultimate view on
Right.
M.
Obviously, if no acquisition occurs, town meeting becomes shorter. But the town already has an enterprise fund with respect to the South Shore Country Club. An enterprise fund is something that is recognized by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as an appropriate way to control, basically account for, all of the revenues and expenses of an enterprise such as a water supply system. And I do want to say that it's my understanding anyway, and that with respect to an enterprise fund, that whatever comes into the water supply system by way of revenue has to stay there and has to be used for the water supply system. And I think we need to keep in mind the distinction between a ratepayer and a taxpayer with respect to the enterprise system. It is the ratepayers that are going to pay the expenses. And so far as I can see, there is only one probably unusual situation where you'd have to have a retained earnings deficit in the enterprise fund where the tax levy could be temporarily affected. Now, that doesn't mean there's a one-year operating loss. What it means is, as Selectman Power said earlier, it's anticipated that in the first year of revenue generation of the water supply system that there's going to be a $4 million surplus. So before there could be a retained earnings deficit, and as I understand it, you'd have to have an operating loss of more than $5 million to wipe out those retained earnings. In that case, the town would then have to step in to make up that deficit and could do that in a number of different ways, I believe, including short-term borrowing. But what would happen is, in the following years, the rates would go up to the ratepayers, and the town's involvement with making up the deficit would need to be repaid by the enterprise. And I would also think that in terms of the persons managing the enterprise, that one thing that they would always be looking for, if in terms of good management, is making sure there wasn't a threat of a retained earnings deficit. So I think that people ought to know that, yes, there is that possibility out there that theoretically can exist, but I think it is probably a remote possibility, not likely to occur except under extraordinary circumstances. And I think the only other thing I'll add at this point, especially in view of the hour, on the enterprise fund, Article 00, is that it also appropriates a budget for the enterprise for the initial year. That budget was submitted to the selectmen by Town Administrator Mayo on February 26th, and so it would appear that the appropriate budgeting has been done in accordance with the statute concerning enterprise funds. Thank you.
Questions on that? Okay. And then we have transition issues. You know, I guess, and also in lieu of, in respect of the hour, I didn't see anything in the discussion we had several meetings ago that looked like transition issues were a game changer for the basic acquisition question. So in other words, I didn't see those as, gee, there's some transition issues, so we can't go ahead with the acquisition. You know, I don't know, others have a different view, but I mean, you know, that is one of the articles that we'll need to discuss at some point if we're going ahead with the.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's my warrant article.
Sure.
So I definitely need to spend some more time looking at, you know, I haven't done a draft comment
Sure.
yet. I know we talked about the economics, because originally we didn't know the amount. I think it's 250K.
Right.
So I have the number part of it, and we'll do some additional research, so.
Okay. All right. So we have a meeting scheduled on Sunday to sort of make up for not having the snow day. We also have cleared our schedules for a meeting on Wednesday as necessary.
Next Wednesday?
Next Wednesday. Oh, yeah, you weren't here last night.
Oh, okay.
Right.
See what happens.
I know, nice. Blissfully ignorant.
Yes.
Would it be possible to schedule that second meeting maybe on Monday instead of Wednesday?
Monday as in, like,
The 11th?
the 11th?
Ahead of your existing AdCom
Well,
scheduled meeting?
So there's an existing AdCom meeting
At
at
7:30.
30.
To the extent you need that meeting. The problem is you're gonna have a difficult time getting support information from the proponents on Wednesday.
Just on Wednesday?
That went Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And Friday.
I'm not sure my schedule really let me get here much earlier than,
Yeah, I think it's difficult to do a meeting for this, and then have us have a full AdCom after that.
if you can convince Donna to move her meeting, we could do Monday night. I guess also we have a number of issues to talk about. I think, Mr. Walsh, you had offered to provide some additional information. Dave, do you have specific items that you'd like from anyone?
I just gotta probably spend some more time with the stuff we got today before I know the answer to that.
All right, so if we meet on Sunday, as we're currently scheduled to, will you be able to, will you have gotten comfortable with your additional questions so that we can have a discussion of those?
Sure.
I think
Yeah.
we'll have had an opportunity to see Bob's drafts. We can talk about that. I'm just trying to lay out what, makes sense for Sunday. Yes.
Just related to that, do you have a deadline by the time you would want anyone who wants to get you information, if they want it considered at this point? Is there a deadline by which they'd have to get it into
Yeah,
you?
if we could have it by Friday afternoon, is that feasible?
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that'd be useful. Anything else then for tonight? Great, I get to use the gavel again? Motion to adjourn?
Second.
Okay.